In early June 1900, a paramilitary group known as the Yihechun suddenly ran wild through the streets of Beijing, the capital of China. Armed with swords and knives, they went around burning and destroying churches, schools, and hospitals run by foreigners, especially foreign missionaries. The Yihechun weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were sort of more like guerrillas. They were recognizable from the red sashes they wore. The true name of their order in Chinese was the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, and many of them believed they were impervious to Western weapons like bullets and artillery. Westerners, especially in the press, called them the Boxers. The violence in Beijing ramped up. On June 11, 1900, a Japanese diplomat, Sugiyama Akira, was murdered while walking down the street, apparently by a member of a Chinese army unit called the Gansu Braves, which had been sent on the futile task of trying to keep order in the capital. Cixi, the Dowager Empress of China, ordered the Braves' commander to punish the perpetrator. He refused, telling her that if anyone under his command was executed, the whole army would mutiny. She backed off. All of the foreigners in Beijing lived in a single compound clustered around the diplomatic legations of their representative countries. There were 11 of them: Great Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Russia, the United States, Japan, Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The main mission of the diplomats was to protect the interests of their countries in China. Most of those countries were involved in colonialist exploitation of China in one sense or another. We'll return to that issue. But first, to understand how explosive this situation with the foreigners and the Yihechun really was, we need to look at the geography involved. This is Beijing today. That is Tiananmen Square, a rather famous place where a massacre that the modern Chinese government doesn't like to talk about happened in 1989. That is a stadium built for the 2008 Olympics. And that is the Forbidden City, the massive palace complex built in the early 15th century where the Chinese emperors lived. This is where the legation's quarter was located. It was small, only 3 kilometers long by 1.5 kilometers wide. You can see how close it was to the Forbidden City. The old city of Beijing looked like this at the time, a jumbled, ancient, chaotic place, very cramped and crowded, a powder keg. It wasn't just foreigners who were at risk from the Yihechun, who hated and targeted anyone who wasn't Chinese, holding them to blame for the country's considerable problems. The Yihechun were also targeting Chinese Christians, and many hundreds of them had taken refuge in the legation's quarter, hoping the missionaries and foreigners' diplomatic status would protect them. They had some reason to hope. On June 10th, a multinational military force consisting of troops from 7 Western nations plus Japan landed at Tianjin, the main port that communicated with the Chinese capital, and they started fighting their way inland to rescue the legations. The Yihechun blew up rail lines and other infrastructure to try to stop them. On June 16th, Cixi held a large meeting of her ministers and generals in the Forbidden City. She was not the actual head of state of China. The figurehead in whose name she wielded power, the Guangxu Emperor, her nephew, was also there. But she dominated him pretty thoroughly, and he didn't say much. The main topic of debate was whether the Chinese state should intervene to try to stop the Boxers or endorse their campaign to wipe out the foreigners, essentially to co-opt them into the Chinese army, the rest of which was pretty ineffectual. One of Cixi's advisors pointed out that the Yihechun were militarily weak. Their main advantage was their audacity, because they believed in their mystical immunity to bullets and such. No one at the meeting literally believed this was true, least of all Cixi herself. But while recognizing China had been terribly weakened, she appealed to the hearts and minds of the people. She decided essentially to declare war on all the foreign powers present in Beijing. She threw open the warehouses where what few guns and other modern weapons the Chinese army had were stored and had them distributed to the Yihechun troops. The siege began on June 20th, 1900. Hordes of Yihechun warriors advanced on the legations, which was defended by about 400 troops. Despite the defense troops being badly outnumbered and very low on ammunition and supplies, the legations were well defended, and it turned out the Yihechun weren't as invulnerable as at least some of them believed. The diplomats and their troops held out for 55 days. On August 14, 1900, the multinational force reached Beijing and relieved the siege. A total of 231 foreigners and probably several thousand Chinese were killed. Cixi, with her nephew in tow, fled the capital, eventually winding up in Xi'an. Foreign troops occupied the Forbidden City for the first time in its history. Cixi sent one of her great diplomats and foreign generals, a man called Li Hongzhang, to negotiate with the foreign powers. The negotiations dragged out for more than a year. China didn't have much to bargain with. On September 17, 1901, China and the foreign powers signed the Boxer Protocol, which obligated the Chinese to pay huge indemnities. Poor Li Hongzhang was so exhausted by the effort that he died only a couple of months later. Cixi and her nephew returned to the Forbidden City. I've always disliked the name that these general events have been given in history, the Boxer Rebellion. For one thing, the term boxers is inaccurate. They were called the Yihechun, and the word rebellion suggests an uprising, an insurrection of some kind against established authority. But in this case, the authority being rebelled against were the 11 foreign powers, who acted as if they were entitled to exploit China, and resistance of any kind by the Chinese was somehow illegitimate. So, I'm a little hesitant to endorse the term Boxer Rebellion, though most Western historians do call it that. More importantly, though, I think we have to recognize that this event, which began China's tumultuous 20th century, was a highly significant one on the road to the revolution, or should I say revolutions plural, that completely remade the world's most populous nation over the first half of that century. What you might not know, and what's often left out of the story by Western historians, is that the violence in Beijing in the hot summer of 1900 caused Cixi, the Dowager Empress, to change her mind in a pretty profound way. Only 2 years earlier, in 1898, she had scotched a reform movement called the 100 Days Reform that would have modernized China's governing institutions, which were based on traditions from hundreds, or in some cases, thousands of years before. But after 1900, she seems to have been convinced that China had to change. It was almost too late, because a number of revolutionary groups were active by then, seeking to modernize China by violent upheaval. Now, the question was whether Cixi could forestall that by enacting constitutional reforms of her own, which, if completed, would be at least some kind of revolution in itself, if not the one that the revolutionaries like Sun Yat-sen wanted. You can already see, just from what we've been through already, that there are a lot of threads to this story. There are, in fact, few stories in modern history more relevant than this one, because I don't think anyone today would dispute that China is one of the most important countries in the world, and what happens there affects all of us. Therefore, China's history matters a lot. This is the story of China's long revolution from 1900 to 1950, a half-century that ended up being profoundly impactful on the history of the world. Hi, my name is Sean Munger. I have a PhD in history, and my niche here on YouTube is doing long, deep dive videos on various historical subjects. While my advanced degrees are in American history, the subject of modern Chinese history is close to my heart, because it's the first subject in history that I studied extensively in college, and it really did capture my imagination with its richness and complexity. While I was in the process of making my last video on Brazil in the World Wars, I found out that the professor from whom I first learned modern Chinese history, Dr. Jonathan Porter of the University of New Mexico, passed away some time ago. Although I'd been thinking of doing this subject for a while on my channel, I decided to do it now as a tribute to him. In the middle of this video, there will be a brief chapter where we'll take a short interlude and I'll talk about Dr. Porter and my relationship to this subject. feel free to skip it if you like, but I thought dedicating a video to him was the least I could do. Just a couple of quick housekeeping and explanatory matters before we dive back in. First, some words on what I am covering, what I'm not covering, and what I'm covering in the members section version. Where in time you mark the Chinese Revolution as beginning or ending is a matter of debate. You could make an argument that China was in a more or less constant state of revolution or war or civil war or some combination thereof, continuously from 1911, when the Qing dynasty was overthrown, to 1949, when Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. I think even those dates are a bit limiting because there was clearly revolutionary change going on before 1911 and after 1949. So, for purposes of this video, I'm drawing the lines basically at 1900 on one end and 1950 on the other. Aside from a few items about Mao's initial moves right after the 1949 establishment of the PRC, I won't be talking about Mao in power. Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, or whatever, that's all beyond our scope here. As you may know, I have a members section on this channel. For $5 a month, you can get expanded versions of my videos ad-free, slightly different versions with additional material. In this particular case, the members section enables me to cover some material that I can't cover on the free version of the channel. Specifically, as this story involves the conflicts between Japan and China during the World War II era, two particular topics, the Nanjing Massacre of 1937 and other atrocities committed by Japan in China, such as the infamous Unit 731, are simply too graphic to have any significant discussion of them pass muster under ad-friendly guidelines, which means that if I included them, this video could not be monetized. Historians do have to earn a living. I mean, we don't go around the countryside living on alms like Buddhist monks. So, however much I might disagree with the monetization rules in that regard, I do have to follow them. Fortunately, I can cover those topics in the members section version, which is not subject to ad-friendly guidelines. So, if you want the full story, including Nanjing 1937 and Unit 731 and related topics, they are in the members section version. If you'll allow me my moment of snark for this video, I'm sure eventually somebody will watch this video and be tempted to leave a comment claiming that I must work for the Chinese Communist Party. Now that's rather ironic, considering that people who don't like this other video that I made, or that one, like to claim that I must be a CIA agent. And some who didn't like this video insist that I must work for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. Get it straight, conspiracy theorists. Make up your minds about who you think I secretly work for. Because honestly, I don't know where to send the invoice. Or, if it's just too much for you, there are literally millions of hours of cat videos here on YouTube that aren't going to watch themselves. So, you might be happier doing that. Okay. Back to reality. As you could plainly see when you clicked on the video, this is a lengthy story. We've already done the Yihechun uprising, the so-called Boxer Rebellion, but the subject of the later reign of Cixi, I think, requires some more detail. Then after that, I'm going to fill in the context, including who Cixi was and how she became the world's most powerful woman at that time. All stuff that happened before 1900. That's in Chapter 3. This is a museum located in the village of Huiheng in Guangdong province, which was called Canton by Westerners. The museum is dedicated to the village's most famous former resident, Sun Yat-sen, who was born here in 1866. Considered the father of the Chinese Revolution, he's an extremely rare example of a figure that both the nationalists and the communists revere. When the story of the Chinese Revolution is told, it often starts with Sun. Sun Yat-sen is a complicated figure. Though the family was poor, his brother Sun-mei became a successful rancher in Hawaii and brought his younger brother there to attend school. Yes, Sun Yat-sen was educated in Honolulu. Sun returned to China and converted to Christianity. By the 1890s, Sun, who studied as a doctor, was convinced that revolution was needed to bring China into the modern world. he founded one of the earliest, if not the first, Chinese Revolutionary Society in Honolulu in 1894. That group was called the Revive China Society, but eventually, after various twists, turns, mergers, and name changes, it morphed into the Kuomintang, the nationalist party that would ultimately rule China or parts of it up until the Communist Revolution of 1949. The Kuomintang, most historians refer to it as the KMT or GMD, still remains in power in Taiwan. Anyway, the Qing dynasty quickly recognized Sun Yat-sen as an enemy and sent him into exile. Japan was one of the places he stayed, and Sun Yat-sen eventually developed a very close relationship with various political figures in Japan. Indeed, the Japanese who went to war with China in 1894 began to see the possibility of encouraging revolution in China as a tool of their own foreign policy, which was becoming increasingly expansionist. Sun's revolutionary groups attempted various uprisings in China during the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. Cixi and the Qing government basically played whack-a-mole with these numerous uprisings, which began before the Yihechun saga, but ramped up sharply after it. Sun's organization was far from the only group pushing revolution and overthrow of the Qing. There were others, such as the Guangfuhui, also known as the Restoration Society, and even a group called the Foot Emancipation Society, which opposed the practice of foot binding and somehow got into the revolution business. As that example shows, these groups were about more than just the political objective of terminating the Qing dynasty. Ideas of social reform were extremely important too, as illustrated by the story of Qiu Jin, one of the major feminist figures of China in this period. She was beheaded after a failed uprising against the dynasty in 1907. There was even a literary component to revolutionary societies. Most of these groups were spearheaded by writers and intellectuals, and various essays, letters, and treatises were published in numerous journals, criticizing the dynasty, the Confucian social order, and exploring various ideas for reform. These literary efforts helped recruit more revolutionaries, especially among what you might call the intelligentsia, many of whom, like Sun Yat-sen and Qiu Jin, studied, lived, or traveled outside of China. There was a tension between these revolutionary groups, who essentially wanted to tear down the system and start a new one, and what you might call constitutionalist groups, who recognized the need for reform but wanted to achieve it by changing the existing system from within. Constitutionalism was thriving even before the Yihechun uprising. Probably the most important constitutionalist was a man called Liang Qichao, a political writer and thinker whose ideas helped spark the 100 Days Reform in 1898, which I'll talk about in the next chapter. Stung by the failure of her policy during the Yihechun thing, Cixi, the Dowager Empress, once she returned to the Forbidden City, started the wheels turning on a reform movement. Now, she was no progressive by any means, but after 40 years in power, she was grasping at anything to keep herself and her dynasty on the throne. Interestingly, banning the practice of foot binding, which she did in 1902, was one of her first reforms. Cixi sent various ministers and envoys to other parts of the world, including Japan and the United States, to study modern governmental institutions. The conceptual model that Cixi seemed to be working off of was the experience of Japan after the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868, the Meiji Restoration, which modernized Japan rapidly and profoundly in only a few short decades. In 1906, after the studies were complete, Cixi announced a plan was afoot to turn China into a constitutional monarchy. There would be a parliament elected by the people, but of course, the emperors would remain the executive power of the state. Now, it wasn't exactly the most democratic system ever conceived, but it was a huge step beyond the archaic and ancient autocracy that had ruled China for most of the last 2,000 years. There would be a 9-year transition period into the new system. Scholars and lawyers within the Qing hierarchy quickly put their noses to the grindstone, drafting a proposed constitution and hashing out the details of how parliament and its elections would work. Yuan Shikai, probably the most powerful general in late Qing China, was also involved in these reforms. Revolutionary as it was, at least compared with the past, the late Qing reforms simply weren't enough for the actual revolutionaries, the groups who, after 1905, had coalesced into a united front called the Tongmenhui, headed by Sun Yat-sen. Aside from the central question of how much reform was needed, among many revolutionaries, the idea of leaving the Qing emperors in charge was a non-starter, for ethnic reasons. The Qing elite were Manchus, a different ethnic group than the Han, which made up the majority of the Chinese people. Much of the sentiment against the dynasty was rooted in resentment that the Manchus, seen as outsiders by many Chinese, were ruling a Han majority nation. I'll get a bit deeper into that issue in the next chapter. By the fall of 1908, neither Cixi nor her nephew, the Guangxu emperor, were doing too well. The Dowager Empress was pooping a lot. Now, I'm not saying that to be funny. It's true. She suffered from severe diarrhea in the final months of her life. She was 73 at that time. Something was wrong with the emperor, too. Age 37, kept pretty much a prisoner by his aunt for the last 10 years, he complained of hearing spectral noises, pains in his lower body, and constant chills. He had previously been diagnosed with nephritis. But it was her impending death, not his, that spurred her to the last significant actions of her life. Cixi had no claim of her own to the throne. She could only hold power in the name of her nephew. Though she left no record of her own sentiments, she probably felt it too dangerous to the dynasty or to her legacy to leave him in power after her death. The Guangxu emperor died on November 14, 1908. The cause of his death was hotly debated by historians for a century afterward, but murder by his aunt, Cixi, was the leading theory. In 2008, chemical tests done on the remains of the dead emperor established that he had died of arsenic poisoning. The arsenic level in his body was 2,000 times higher than that of an ordinary person. Though Yuan Shikai has sometimes been fingered as the murderer, the natural assumption is that Cixi herself ordered him to be poisoned. She was herself dying at the time. Indeed, she lived only 22 hours longer, perishing the next day, November 15, 1908. In her will, dictated just hours before her death, she named the Guangxu emperor's nephew, Puyi, then 3 years old, as the new ruler. The regent making decisions for him would be the new Empress Dowager Longyu, who was the Guangxu emperor's widow. In practical effect, Puyi's father, known as Prince Chun, also acted as regent. The succession decision probably closed off all remaining hope, what little there still might have been, that the constitutionalist project could have forestalled a revolution in China. Cixi didn't really plan for the succession. A strong emperor with an independent power base might have pulled it off. But, like most dictators, Cixi had spent her reign eliminating any competing source of power. And when she was gone, the dynasty just sort of wilted into nothing. The final ruler of Imperial China, Puyi, was of course the subject of Bernardo Bertolucci's 1987 biopic, The Last Emperor, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture that year. One of my very first videos on this channel, way back in 2016, was a historical analysis of that film. Now, I'm not sure I'm going to recommend that you watch that video, as it is an early effort and thus kind of cringe, but if you're interested, it's there. Puyi will pop up again briefly in Chapter 10. The dude had a very strange life. Before we move on to the 1911 revolution, we need to go back and fill in some context. Who was Cixi anyway, and how did she come to power? Why was China so weak in 1900? What were the foreign powers doing there? All of that is covered in the next chapter. Chinese history is basically a cycle. A new dynasty comes to power, initiates change and reform, hits sort of a golden age, then after a few centuries falls into corruption, decay, and decline. It's overthrown, there's a period of chaos and civil war, and a new dynasty comes to power. Rinse and repeat. The last time before 1911 that the cycle renewed itself was in 1644, when the Qing dynasty was founded. The Manchus came from the northeastern part of China, Manchuria, and were known before the unification of their various tribes into one people as the Jurchens. I referenced in the last chapter that the Manchus were a different ethnic group than most of the people in central and southern China, the Han. They had different customs and a separate cultural identity, even a different language. The Ming dynasty, which was in decline in the early 17th century, was ruled by Han people. I won't get into the long story of the transition between the Ming and Qing dynasties, but the event that traditionally marks the changeover is when the Chongzhen emperor hanged himself from a tree on April 25, 1644, as Manchu forces closed in on Beijing. A man named Hong Taiji was recognized as the first Qing emperor of China. Just an explanatory note, Chinese rulers are usually referred to by a special name chosen to identify their reign, which is different than their personal names. So if you hear me say things like the Chongzhen Emperor, that's a regnal name. Hong Taiji ruled as the Taizong Emperor. The Manchu royal family was the Aisin-Jioro clan, which remained in power, at least officially, until 1912. Once they took over, the Qing didn't let the people of China forget that they were in charge, or that they were a different ethnic group than the Han. One of the visible symbols of their rule was forcing men to wear their hair in a braided queue, which derived from a hairstyle popular among the Manchus. Traditionally, the feet of young girls were bound, essentially broken, at a young age, and that had been the custom in China since the early Middle Ages. But Manchu women were exempt from this custom. In many other respects, though, the Qing was a pretty typical Chinese dynasty. Their misfortune was that they came to power so late in history. The ancient and medieval style of rule and society that the Qing employed was utterly unsuited for a world that was moving into modernity. The 17th century saw the roots of the Enlightenment in Europe. The Age of Discovery had knitted the world together in a new way with technology, trade, commerce, and colonialism. And medieval modes of thought were simply outdated and archaic in this kind of new world. Arguably the best emperor the Qing fielded, the Qianlong Emperor, died in 1799. After that, it was pretty much all downhill. An incident from late in the Qianlong reign typified China's disdain for engagement with the world and with modernity. In 1793, the British sent a diplomatic mission called the Macartney Mission, no, not that McCartney, to China to open diplomatic relations and especially to relax the draconian trade restrictions that the Qing imposed on foreigners. The mission failed. Not only did the Qianlong Emperor basically treat the British as distant tributaries of China, but he told them point blank that the Chinese didn't have any need for, quote, the manufactures of outside barbarians. Western countries, especially Britain, had huge trade deficits with China. Many people in the West wanted Chinese goods, particularly silk, porcelain, and tea, but Britain paid in cash for these goods, usually in silver, and they didn't import anything from other countries. The Brits decided to try to fix their trade deficit by the uniquely evil strategy of getting a lot of Chinese people hooked on drugs. The British grew opium in India and South Asia, and they smuggled a lot of it into China. The idea was that supplying an addictive drug would create a self-renewing market and balance their trade deficit. It wasn't all British either. A number of Americans were also involved in opium dealing in China. At first, the opium trade was mutually beneficial. The Chinese benefited by getting a steady stream of cash. But opium proved controversial in China, not just because of the human toll of drug addiction, but because people thought it was disrupting the careful Confucian family and social relations of their society. When the Chinese asked the British politely if they'd stop dealing dope in China, the British responded by perforating people with cannonballs. Yes, it sounds crazy, but the Opium Wars, the first of which lasted from 1839 to 1842, was fought to enable the British to deal drugs in China, under the fig leaf of expanding trade opportunities. The Qing military was archaic and no match for British sea power. Chinese forces crumpled under the assault. The settlement China was forced to sign in 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing, opened 5 major ports to British trade and granted numerous other concessions, including indemnities and reimbursements for opium destroyed by the Chinese. Foreigners were immune from Chinese law for any crimes they might commit in China. The responsibility for collecting customs duties was turned over to foreign nations as a means of collecting indemnities for the war. This treaty is also how the British got Hong Kong, which remained theirs until the famous handover in 1997. A renewal of hostilities, the Second Opium War, broke out in 1856. By this time, Britain and other powers, including France, Russia, and the United States, were basically seeking to loot China for political and economic gain. The Qing did even worse in this second war, and they were forced to sign even more unequal treaties, giving away various pieces of Chinese sovereignty to Western powers. This was also how we got the legations in Beijing, which were besieged by the Yihechun in 1900, and how Christian missionaries, once suppressed in China, began to circulate much more freely throughout the interior of the country than they had before. At the time of the Second Opium War, the biggest internal revolt in China's history was raging in the southern provinces. In 1851, a man called Hong Zuchen, a Christian, announced that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and declared what he called the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. Hong explicitly called for the overthrow of the Qing dynasty and offered the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom as an alternative government. This triggered basically a civil war within China that lasted almost 15 years and caused the deaths of tens of millions of people. Indeed, although the exact body count is disputed and impossible to pin down for sure, many scholars believe that it could be around 30 million, which puts the Taiping Rebellion in probably the top 5 most lethal wars in human history, possibly even ahead of World War I. It took years for the Qing's weak army to stamp out the Taiping rebels, who made things harder for their own movement by warring amongst themselves. For the record, Hong Zuchen, the self-proclaimed brother of Christ, died in June 1864. Though the imperial government survived, the Taiping Rebellion was a huge disaster for the Qing dynasty. It underscored how weak the Qing had become. Not long after the Taiping Rebellion began, in 1852, a 16-year-old girl named Cixi came to the Chinese court as one of a number of entrants in essentially a game show to select potential concubines for the new ruler, the Zhanfeng Emperor, then in his early 20s. He had come to the throne in 1850. Cixi was one of the winners of this game show, and she became a concubine, not a wife, of the emperor. She was not of royal blood, not from the Aisenjioro clan, which makes her rise to power all the more remarkable. Cixi's path to political power was through her son. In 1856, Cixi had a son by the Zhanfeng Emperor. When his father, the emperor, died in August 1861, it triggered a power struggle within the court. Though far from the most important woman at court, she wasn't even the only Empress Dowager. Cixi maneuvered things around pretty deftly to slam the door on the former emperor's main advisors, especially an official called Su Shun. After the palace coup that Cixi engineered in 1861, she had Su Shun publicly beheaded. In the late 19th century, Cixi was arguably the most powerful woman in the world. Yes, even more so than Queen Victoria, who was ruling at the same time. Vicky was mostly a figurehead, but Cixi wielded actual power and dictated national policy directly. She managed to terminate the Taiping Rebellion, restructure the court, and rescue the government's failing finances. But she was unable to stop the relentless advance of the imperialist powers meddling in China and around its edges. Cixi was crafty enough to survive in power despite the death of her son, the Tongxi Emperor, from smallpox in 1875. She arranged it so her nephew could ascend to the throne as the Guangxu Emperor. This is the guy she would eventually assassinate in 1908. By 1889, the Guangxu Emperor was out of the regency period and could make his own decisions. In 1895, China got utterly clowned in the First Sino-Japanese War, which consolidated Japan's control over Korea. The settlement of the war also forced China to give up Taiwan, known by the Japanese as Formosa, to them. Realizing that something had to be done, in 1898, the Guangzhou emperor was persuaded by Liang Qichao, who I mentioned before, and another scholar, Kang Youwei, to enact various reforms. There would be new government ministries, moves toward technological and commercial modernization, and the establishment of Confucianism as the state religion, which actually would have weakened it by demoting it to a faith rather than the sacred basis of the whole social order, which it had been for centuries of China's history. Cixi couldn't have this. She slammed him down hard, as I noted earlier. She staged another coup from behind the scenes, which ended with her imprisoning her nephew on a man-made island in the palace complex. Cixi reassumed direct control of policy, and she quickly canceled the reform program. It had lasted 100 days, and thus is known as the 100 Days Reform. This basically brings us up to where we started, 1900 and the Yihechun uprising. Let's move ahead now to the revolution that finally brought down the Qing dynasty. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on the 1911 revolution. It wasn't a huge dramatic moment like the storming of the Winter Palace in the Russian Revolution, or even the proclamation of the People's Republic in 1949. What's usually called the Wuchang Uprising, which occurred on October 10, 1911, was kind of a run-of-the-mill urban revolt, like many that were going on in China at that time. If you'll indulge me by allowing me to quote myself, I'm going to cut in a short clip of how I explained this revolution in my video on the fall of the monarchies. It's not self-plagiarism because I'm acknowledging that I said it before. So, this is me from 2 years ago. Yes, I've moved offices since then, but I am still wearing the same shirt. Yes, I've washed it. Take it away, me from the past. By this time, there were revolts and rebellions against the Qing dynasty popping up everywhere all the time. It seemed very clear to many people in China that the dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven, and with all the revolutionaries running around, it was only a matter of time before the dynasty fell. While the Double 10 revolution that brought it down was certainly not accidental, there is sort of an element of randomness to it, in the sense that it might have been any of the numerous rebellions that could have caught fire across the country and eventually brought down the government. The Wuchang Uprising grew out of a dispute over China's railroads, which the Qing government had just nationalized. They were planning to sell the railroads to Western powers to pay off the enormous indemnity following the Yihechun Uprising. A railway rights protection movement got going, with numerous demonstrations in many places throughout China, but particularly in Hubei province. In Wuchang, the capital of Hubei province, on October 9, 1911, a bomb blew up accidentally in a warehouse where a revolutionary group was stockpiling weapons for a planned uprising. Since they knew the police investigation would smoke them out, the revolutionary cell decided to move ahead the date of their planned rebellion, and they started it the next day. The governor-general of Hubei province panicked and ran away from the city. That was the start of a domino effect that spread through several provinces. The Qing government called on their most prestigious general, Yuan Shikai, to put down the revolts. Yuan quickly realized that this was a golden opportunity to accumulate power for himself, which he was very good at. He started making secret deals with the revolutionaries and placing his own men in key positions in the provinces. There were really only a few major battles, such as those at Hankow and Hanyang in October and November 1911, though there were significant outbreaks of ethnic violence in various places. As the Qing dynasty collapsed, various groups, including Han and Chinese Muslims, seized their chance to get back at their Manchu oppressors, and there are reports of massacres of Manchus, including one in Chiang, the old medieval era imperial capital. Under the weight of the unrest sweeping the country, the Qing government crumpled like a soda can. In November and December 1911, various imperial officials tendered their resignations, while likewise revolutionary councils and organizations started setting up provisional government entities in Wuhan, Shanghai, and Nanjing. The military fulcrum of the 1911 revolution was undoubtedly Yuan Shikai, who had carefully spun events to benefit himself and his power. The political fulcrum was Sun Yat-sen, who was actually out of the country when the Wuchang uprising happened, and had to hurry back to participate in the events that he, or at least his followers, would credit him with having set in motion. On December 29, 1911, the provisional government elected Sun Yat-sen president, and a few days later, on New Year's Day, 1912, Sun proclaimed the establishment of the Republic of China. Why did this all happen so quickly? Some historians credit the influence of the telegraph, a factor that hadn't really been present in previous cycles of revolts against the Qing. When the Wuchang uprising occurred, news of it spread throughout China via the telegraph, and events assumed a momentum of their own that couldn't be stopped. There was also a marked power vacuum at the top. The emperor, Puyi, known as the Zhuan-Tong Emperor, was just a toddler. Clearly, he couldn't give orders. His regents never really had the same control over the government that Cixi had. In one sense, there was really no one in charge at the Forbidden City. Nevertheless, the negotiations between the new republic and the dynasty for the emperor's abdication, negotiations brokered by Yuan Shikai, naturally, dragged on through the winter. But Yuan spun this one to his advantage too. Revolutionary armies had not yet reached Beijing. Yuan subtly threatened the imperial family that they might not be safe if the emperor didn't abdicate before they got there. But he also lured Sun Yat-sen into offering to resign the presidency, which he'd only held for a month or so, if Yuan could get the imperials to quit. On February 12, 1912, the regents signed the document, and the Zhuan-Tong Emperor Puyi abdicated the throne. On March 10th, Yuan Shikai was sworn in as president of the Republic of China. Though Sun Yat-sen would eventually be the chairman of the Kuomintang, he would never officially sit in the president's chair again. Yuan Shikai, not the provisional government, had the real power in China, which was military, not political. Yuan commanded what was known as the Beiyang Army, the strongest military force in China at the time. Yuan himself had founded this army in 1895 and had been molding it into his personal power base ever since then. 1912 was a chaotic year in China, but also a hopeful one. Various Chinese politicians were drafting a constitution, establishing personal rights and new governmental institutions, and working diligently to forge a modern republic out of the ruins of the old autocracy. Sun Yat-sen spent most of his time abroad, raising money and lobbying for international recognition of the new regime. Unfortunately, the military men, Yuan Shikai chief among them, were working at cross purposes to all of these hopeful moves. As we'll see, Yuan's swelled head eventually led to an episode that might have undone all the progress that the 1911 revolution had made. That story is in the next chapter. Yuan Shikai, I think, fundamentally misread the 1911 revolution. He saw it in terms of a change of dynasty with a strong ethnic dimension, the return to rule by Han Chinese after centuries of oppression by Manchus, who he regarded as outsiders, like the Mongols who had ruled during the Yuan dynasty of the 13th and 14th centuries. He didn't really appreciate that that was just one thread that had led to the revolution, and that many Chinese really did want to live in a modern country with a modern democratic government. China's first elections occurred at the end of 1912 and beginning of 1913. The Kuomintang, Sun Yat-sen's party, did very well and claimed a large majority. Song Zhaoren, a young political organizer for the KMT, was instrumental in this victory. He was also the one who had drafted China's provisional constitution. On March 20th, 1913, at this railway station in Shanghai, a hitman in the employ of a Shanghai underworld kingpin walked up to Song Zhaoren and shot him twice at close range. He died a few days later in a hospital. While we don't know for sure, Yuan Shikai was likely behind this assassination. When Yuan later dismissed the governors of various provinces, causing others to declare independence, what historians have called the Second Revolution was underway. There was also heavy fighting, with Yuan's Beiyang army crushing various revolts. He was moving toward replacement of the new democratic system with the restoration of the imperial monarchy, with himself at its head. In fact, Yuan dissolved the parliament entirely in January 1914. In August, World War I broke out in Europe. Germany had a significant colonial holding in China, the Shandong Peninsula, and pretty much as soon as the bullets began flying in Europe, Japan swooped down to seize Shandong. After a siege of Qingdao, German forces surrendered in November 1914. 2 months later, Japan presented Yuan Shikai with a document called the 21 Demands, which sought to get China's acquiescence to Japan's occupation of Shandong, along with numerous other concessions, including one later deleted, that Japan take control of finance and police functions within China. Yuan knew he needed the support of the Japanese if he was to be the restored emperor. So, in May 1915, he accepted the demand letter with the exception of that one section that was deleted. This enraged many Chinese and was to prove pretty critical in a couple of years. In December 1915, Yuan Shikai announced the resumption of the monarchy, with himself in the office of emperor. He really hoped to re-establish a dynasty from his own family, but it was clear he had overreached. 2 provinces declared independence. Warlords began marshaling armies to oppose him. Yuan seemed surprised. On March 21, 1916, he rescinded the proclamation of the Imperial Restoration. He would remain as president, but just forget about that emperor stuff. My bad, sorry. The warlords marching against him, such as the National Defense Army headed by Kai-shek, were undeterred. As 2 more provinces, Hunan and Sichuan, declared independence, Yuan Shikai's health took a turn for the worse and he was confined to his bed. He was already badly sick from kidney failure. On June 6, 1916, he died, age 56. Li Yuanhong, the provisional vice president, took over as president of China. Yuan Shikai was pretty hated by this point, and his death was a surprisingly well-timed exit from the political stage. But China's government continued to fracture. In April 1917, the United States entered World War I by declaring war on Germany. Both the US and Japan heavily pressured China to break diplomatic relations with Germany, declare war, and join the Allies. The Kuomintang plus the president Li Yuanhong opposed the idea, but the premier Duan Qiri, who was amassing power of his own as a warlord, was strongly in favor of it. He thought that if China participated with the Allies, it would improve its relations with the Western powers and Japan. When Li dismissed Duan from his post and the crisis deepened, Li turned to another warlord, Zhang Jun, to help shore up his power. This was a bad move. Zhang Jun went rogue, turned on Li, the president, marched his army into Beijing, and even took Li prisoner. Zhang was not only pro-German, but pro-monarchy. Now in control of the capital, he attempted to put Pu Yi, age 11, who was still living in the Forbidden City under an arrangement with the Republic, back on the throne. This didn't take either. Duan Qiri counterattacked. His army incredibly used airplanes to bomb the Forbidden City. They didn't do much damage, but it was the first time aerial bombardment was used as a tactic by the Republic of China. Outflanked, Zhang Jun gave up and fled to the legation of the Netherlands. On July 12, 1917, the short-lived restoration of the dynasty ended. China's leader was now an interim president, Feng Guozhang, but the whole government was hopelessly divided. China did eventually enter the war, declaring against the Central Powers on August 14, 1917. The move was political. China didn't contribute militarily to the war at all. Let's fast forward to the end of the war because something significant happened as a result of it. Intellectuals, particularly at universities, had been emboldened by the 1911 revolution. And throughout this whole period, there was kind of a Cold War going on between various political thinkers and pundits. This battle was fought with journal articles, editorials, meetings, posters, that sort of thing. The idea was not just to remake China's politics, but its whole culture. Though not unified in their demands, this intellectual wave came to be known as the New Culture Movement, and it was centered in the universities, especially in Beijing. Germany called for an armistice in November 1918, and the Allied powers got down to the business of squabbling over the peace treaty and the spoils. China, as a member of the Allies, sent a representative, Gu Weijun, known in the English-speaking world as Wellington Koo, to negotiate at the Treaty of Versailles. China's chief demand was to get the Shandong Peninsula back, which, as you recall, had belonged to Germany, then Japan. China didn't fare too well at Versailles. After the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 flipped Russia from white to red, the Allies were a bit concerned about the Bolsheviks, and Japan negotiated an agreement with the Chinese government to deploy Japanese troops along the border between Russia and China, just in case the Reds decided to attack. This agreement, though unpopular in China when it was made public, was still in force. It got worse. Remember that guy, Duan Quri? Well, just before the war ended, in September 1918, he made a secret deal with the Japanese government to take out a bunch of loans, mainly to finance the buildup of his own army, in exchange for letting Japan build a couple of railroads in China. A term of the deal was that China was supposed to recognize Japan's ownership of the Shandong Peninsula. When these items were brought up at Versailles, the British, led by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and the French, led by Clemenceau, sided with Japan. Woodrow Wilson, who had already backtracked on promise after promise that he'd made to various countries, did nothing. China was essentially shut out. The 21 demands were not rescinded, and China did not get Shandong province back. On May 4th, 1919, thousands of students from Beijing's major universities marched in a huge demonstration in Tiananmen Square. It was reminiscent in some ways of the huge demonstrations that would occur there 70 years later. Workers went on strike to join the students, and the strikes spread to other cities, including Shanghai. What's called the May 4th movement paralyzed China for about a month. Gu Weijun refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles. In fact, China was the only one of the Allies who refused it, but it kind of didn't matter, as it made no difference, and in fact alienated China even more from the West. But the May 4th movement, though it didn't really get its main demands met, turned out to be pretty significant in China's history in the 20th century. Several major participants in this movement later came together to form the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. I'm going to talk about that development in the next chapter, but first, I think we should take a look at the two major personalities who would shape China throughout its revolutionary period, and whose careers were just getting started at this time. Let's meet them now. This is a house located in the village of Jikou in Zhejiang province, not too far from Shanghai, on October 31st, 1887. On the second floor of this house, which was above a salt warehouse at the time, a woman named Wang Saiyu gave birth to a baby who was called Jiang Ruyuan. He was the second son of a salt merchant who was at the time the equivalent of upper middle class, though not wealthy. Jiang Ruyuan would later have another name, Jieshi. The old Cantonese pronunciation of this name is Kai-shek. That's who we're talking about. Chiang Kai-shek, the eventual leader of the Kuomintang, the Republic of China, and Taiwan. In late Qing Dynasty China, the examination system was still the path to advancement. This was where young men, they were always men, would study up on the ancient Confucian classics and then take an exam, which, if they passed, would enable them to get jobs as tax collectors, constables, or other positions in the state bureaucracy. This had been the system in China for centuries. Well, in 1903, Chiang Kai-shek took the exams and flunked. He went to a Confucian academy in Fenghua called the Dragon River School, presumably to try to regroup and take the exams again at some point. But he was both fascinated by military organization and technology, and also angered by the way China was being treated by the foreign powers after the Yihechun uprising. In 1906, he decided to quit school and went to Japan. At this time, he also cut off his queue, the hair braid that signified obedience to the Manchu emperor. Chang chose a military career and went to a military academy in Japan for a while. After the 1911 revolution, he returned to China and joined the KMT. Jiang's politics in this period actually leaned considerably in favor of Marxism and the Bolsheviks, whose revolution in Russia in 1917 was tremendously exciting to socialists in many countries, whether or not they self-identified as communists. Jiang also ingratiated himself with the KMT's founder, Sun Yat-sen. Jiang was put in charge of the Guangdong Army, which was Sun's bodyguard and military force. His personal life was tumultuous as well. Chiang Kai-shek would eventually get married 3 times and also had several concubines, as well as countless extramarital affairs. There is also evidence that he was a domestic abuser, frequently beating his wives. This was not uncommon in China in this period. The factor that really cemented Jiang's trajectory into power was when Sun appointed him in 1924 commandant of the Whampoa Military Academy in Guangzhou. Sun established this military school, intended to be the most prestigious one in China, in somewhat the same way that the Bolsheviks developed the Red Army. The Whampoa Military Academy was ultimately the base from which Jiang was able to launch his military conquests and also build his cohort of loyal officers. Here's another historic house located in Shaoshan, Hunan province. It was the home of the family of a prosperous farmer, Mao Zedong, who despite being dirt poor at birth, eventually ran his rice farm so well that his family became the richest farmers, relatively speaking, in the area. In this house, possibly this very room, his wife, Wen Qimei, gave birth to a son on December 26, 1893. That son was Mao Zedong. Growing up on the farm, Mao was brought into the life of peasant farmers, albeit relatively wealthy ones, and he also often came into conflict with his father. He was extremely well-read, reading Chinese classics as well as translations of Western books of economics, philosophy, and history. He wanted to be a teacher. Not long after the 1911 revolution, Mao went to the First Normal School of Hunan, now called Hunan First Normal University. Remember I said in the last chapter that the New Culture movement and what eventually became the May 4th movement arose out of a lot of intellectual and literary activity in China in the late 19-teens? Well, Mao was well versed in that. He founded numerous student organizations, which often included people who would be his compatriots or enemies during the nationalist and communist periods. And after moving to Beijing, he took part in the May 4th movement. On July 21, 1921, at a house in Shanghai located in the French Concession, 53 delegates from various regional and local parties came together and officially formed the Chinese Communist Party. Mao was there representing Changsha, notably a representative of the Comintern, the Bolshevik agency founded in Moscow and charged with encouraging communist revolutions in other countries, was also there. It should be noted that although Mao was present at the founding, he was not the leader of the Chinese Communist Party in the beginning. In fact, he wasn't even really that important in it until many years later. I don't have time in this video to say a lot about Mao Zedong's philosophy of revolution. Suffice it to say, Marx, who was a historian, not a revolutionary or politician, wrote initially in the 1840s that a socialist revolution would come about as a result of industrial workers rising up to seize the means of production. The implication was that the first countries to achieve communism would be the most advanced industrialized ones: Britain, the United States, Germany, etc. Lenin stretched the envelope a bit further in his reworking of the theory in order to explain why a communist revolution should be able to work in a country like Russia, which was mostly agrarian with a very thin crust of industrialization and proletarian workers in the cities. He basically said that a communist revolution, even in a mostly agrarian country, should be led by a revolutionary vanguard of urban workers. That is, in fact, what happened in Russia in 1917. Problem though, that model didn't translate too well to China, which had even less industrialization and fewer urban proletarian workers than Russia did. This was Mao's contribution to communist thought, arguing that in China, essentially a peasant society, the peasants could and should be the vanguard of the revolution, joining forces with urban workers to lead the country to communism. Now, I realize this is a vast oversimplification. There is a lot more to it than that, but that's the basic thrust. The Kuomintang's ideology was a little less concrete. Throughout its history, it was identified with Chinese nationalism, but what that really meant and how they expressed it changed over time. From 1917 and well into the 1920s, the KMT was supported by the Soviet Union, and KMT members, though not communists, could kind of sound like them at times. Principally, Sun Yat-sen and the KMT were against foreign influence and in favor of modernizing China, bringing it out of its medieval Confucian past that they thought had arrested its development. This is a long way of saying that at least in the late 19-teens and early 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, however different they were in ideology, were thrown together in a common enterprise. In fact, Mao was technically a member of the KMT for a while, and in the later 1920s was on some of its governing committees. Still, many in the Kuomintang deeply distrusted the communists and did what they could to limit their influence in the party. The political situation of the warlords controlling various pieces of China and the necessity of defeating them in order to get the country under control gave rise to the idea of what's called the United Front. Even the Soviet Union backed this idea. In 1923, Sun Yat-sen officially allied the KMT with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet observer sent to advise him, Mikhail Borodin, encouraged Sun to work hand in hand with the communists. This was always destined to be an awkward arrangement, not least because these two personalities, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, were so different. Now we have to try to understand who they were struggling against, the warlords. Whenever a state collapses, or a central government doesn't have the authority it needs to keep order in a country, you're going to get warlords. It's happened more recently in Somalia, in Afghanistan, and in parts of Africa. This fact of how the world works is highly inconvenient for anarchists and some more extreme libertarians, but China's experience in the 19-teens and 20s shows that it is undeniably true. Instead of showcasing individual warlords, we'd be here all day if I was doing that. I'm going to go over some of the major factions or cliques and mention a few, but not all, of the prominent people associated with them. There were two main groups of factions, those in the north of China and those in the south. Now we're going to go really fast here. The northern factions came about after Yuan Shikai croaked and his Beiyang army split into hostile groups. We've got the Anhui faction, generally pro-Japanese. A prominent leader was Duan Quri, who we already met. Their archenemies were the Zhili faction, which sometimes controlled Beijing. Feng Guozhang was a major leader and was president of China for a time until he died in 1919 and was replaced by Cao Kun. By the mid-1920s, Wu Peifu was in charge of it. Then there was the Fengtian faction, whose power base was Manchuria, northeast China. The chief guy here was Zhang Zuolin. Look at that mustache. Until the Japanese iced him by blowing up his train in 1928. I'll talk about that. He was succeeded by his son, Zhang Zuoliang. There were a few others, like the Shaanxi or Jin faction, led by Yan Zhishan, who managed to get himself on the cover of Time magazine in 1930. There was the Three Ma's of the Northwest, sounds like a bad sitcom, all ruled by generals named Ma, and the small pro-royalist faction of Zhang Jun, who we met in Chapter 5. Southern factions. There was the Yunnan faction, headed by Kai-yi, that came out of the National Defense Army. You had two successive factions within Guangxi province, we'll call them Old Guangxi and New Guangxi. Old Guangxi headed by Ken Chunjuan. He famously declared, "If Yuan Shikai lives, I die," which sounds like the title of a Hong Kong action film. New Guangxi headed by Li Zongren, who was briefly president of China in 1949, right before Mao messed it up. There was even a warlord in Mongolia, though he wasn't Chinese. The infamous Russian madman, Rowman von Ungern-Sternberg, who thought he was Genghis Khan, yes, he literally thought that, he went mucking around up there and tangling with various Chinese warlords until he faced a Bolshevik firing squad in 1921. Too long a story to get into here. Clear as mud, right? Kind of like gangsters in an urban area, each of these warlords had their own territories and were sometimes at war with each other, or allied with each other, or shifting back and forth, or all of the above. Attempting a narrative story of the struggles between the warlords is kind of pointless. Suffice it to say, they were generally poor administrators. In some warlord territories, inflation went out of control. Some, probably most of the warlords, enabled or encouraged organized crime or outright banditry, and many used their provinces to line their own pockets through taxes, kickbacks, and drug dealing. Naturally, China was a hot market for weapons manufacturers, who were more than happy to have new outlets for their products now that World War I was over. These guys had no hope of stabilizing the country. None of them was powerful enough to knock off the others, and they were too jealous and greedy to work with each other for very long. The Kuomintang, Communist Party, and the Soviets were fractious too, but at least they realized that if there was any chance of defeating the warlords, they would have to work together, at least for a while. That was the idea of the United Front. Sun Yat-sen established Whampoa Military Academy, which Chiang Kai-shek was in charge of, to train and build an army that could take on the warlords and maybe have a hope of getting China under control. Unfortunately, right as he started to have a chance of reuniting and reforming the KMT, Sun died of a fast-moving cancer in March 1925. This triggered a power struggle within the party, the last thing they needed. Chiang Kai-shek ultimately won this contest. He emerged as the undisputed military leader of the Kuomintang thanks to those troops he trained at Whampoa Military Academy. Just to put into perspective what a huge project the Kuomintang took on, they had about 100,000 troops of their own. The warlords they wanted to defeat, however, had nearly 1 million all combined. However, the KMT's biggest advantage was disunity among their enemies. The military campaign has come to be known as the Northern Expedition. First on the target list was Wu Peifu and the Zhili faction. With an invasion of Hunan province in the summer of 1926, Chang broke Wu's army in part because Wu was distracted by fighting with another warlord. Next, the KMT targeted Sun Chuanfang, another Zhili warlord. Realizing he was on the extinction list, Sun teamed up with the Fengtian faction, which didn't help in the long run. Sun lost strength, and the KMT turned against Fengtian too. Long story short, by the spring of 1927, eventually Chang's National Revolutionary Army had defeated the Zhili and Anhui factions, for the most part, and they held the provincial capitals of Wuhan and Nanchang, as well as Shanghai. Their armies were growing rapidly in strength, and Chiang had a lot of political clout. But the fragile coalition between the nationalists and communists, the United Front, was about to split apart. On April 11, 1927, a KMT official named Du Yuesheng, who was also a member of a secret criminal society called the Green Gang, invited his friend and colleague Wang Shahua, a communist labor leader, to his house for a meeting. During this meeting, Du advised Wang to quit the Communist Party and go all in on the Kuomintang. Wang declined. As he left the house that evening, 2 hitmen popped out and blew away Wang Shahua. Over the next few hours, KMT operatives and troops took over various offices and facilities in Shanghai, hunting communists. A massacre occurred, with Kuomintang troops rounding up and killing hundreds, perhaps thousands, of communists. Some of these executions were highly public, occurring in the streets. It was the beginning of a large-scale purge of communists from the KMT, and historians mark it as the beginning of the Chinese Civil War, which would last off and on for 22 years. Why did it happen? Well, despite all the factors that indicated that KMT and the communists should work together, there was deep distrust between them. Sun Yat-sen, when he was still alive, distrusted the communists but preferred foreign help from the Soviet Union rather than the Western powers that had done so much damage to China. The communists had pledged back in 1924 not to try to hijack the KMT or use it for the purpose of class struggle. The goal was to unite China and defeat the warlords, or so they said. Of course, they didn't really mean that. The Soviets and the Chinese communists were perfectly willing to cozy up with anybody that could help them advance their goals. After Sun Yat-sen's death, and especially as Chiang Kai-shek's military and political power grew in 1926 and early 27, it became clear that Chiang was turning against them. The political split within the KMT, not just with communists, but between left and right-leaning factions of the party, that split was growing wider. One of the triggers of the massacre was that in late March 1927, a major union, the General Trade Union of Shanghai, controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, was planning a general strike in Shanghai as part of a strategy to kick out the foreigners from the Shanghai International Settlement, a foreign enclave that had been set up after the Opium Wars. Shanghai's capitalists, the merchants and factory owners, obviously didn't want this. The Shanghai bankers and factory owners financed Chiang Kai-shek and his regime, so he was in large measure beholden to them. The communists wouldn't back down from their plans to spread economic unrest through Shanghai. By early April, Chang had made his decision: purge the KMT of all the communists. After the massacre broke into the streets on April 12th, purges and killings spread to many areas under KMT control. And it wasn't just a conflict between the KMT and communists, because there were factions, as I said a moment ago, within the Kuomintang that were horrified at what was going on, particularly the faction headquartered in Wuhan. Indeed, even Sung Qingling, the widow of Sun Yat-sen, denounced Chang and declared him an enemy of the revolution. Chiang Kai-shek established his capital at Nanjing on April 18, 1927, but the bloodbath was just getting started. As his supporters attacked communists, the communists responded by stirring up agitation among the peasants out in the countryside. Pretty soon, people were killing each other all over China. It's unclear the death toll from the purge. Some estimates put it as high as 1 million. Ultimately, Chang outflanked the Wuhan faction and emerged as the central leader of the Kuomintang. For their part, naturally, the Soviets immediately withdrew their support for the KMT. Stalin was outraged. Communists went into hiding in various places in China, but as we'll see, they weren't down for the count quite yet. During this period, Chiang Kai-shek got married. On December 1st, 1927, in Shanghai, Zhang married Sung Mei-ling, a beautiful socialite 20 years younger than him. Incidentally, Sung Mei-ling was the younger sister of Sung Qingling, the widow of Sun Yat-sen. Politically, this turned out to be an extremely advantageous marriage. Sun Mei-ling, called Madame Chang in the Western press, spoke English and had been educated in the United States. That becomes important in the World War II era. With the communist purge behind him, Chiang set out to complete the Northern Expedition. The next war started on April 7th, 1928, and it was principally against Zhang Zuolin, the guy with the mustache, of the Fengtian faction. By now, the KMT's army numbered more than 1 million, swollen not just by recruits, but by absorbing the armies of warlords they had already defeated and who wisely decided to cooperate with the KMT, principally to avoid the inconvenience of being shot in the head. As you may recall, Zhang and the Fengtian faction had heavy Japanese support. The Japanese had some troops in parts of Manchuria. It was called the Kwantung Army, mainly to guard railways that they, the Japanese, had been given as concessions. As the KMT armies closed in on him, Zhang ran away to hide behind the Japanese, who he thought were unwilling to let Manchuria be controlled by the KMT. Eventually, he reached a deal with the KMT. If he remained in hiding in Manchuria, Chiang Kai-shek wouldn't chase him there. But on June 4th, 1928, Zhang Zuolin's railway carriage was blown up by a mysterious explosion. Who did it? Well, the Japanese. Their idea was that killing Zhang would create a political crisis that would allow them to take over Manchuria directly. It didn't, but remember this, it becomes important later. Zhang Zuolin's son, Zhang Zuoliang, pledged allegiance to the KMT. Nationalist forces eventually took over Beijing. They kept their capital at Nanjing, but the collapse of resistance in most of the rest of China left Chiang Kai-shek sort of by default as the leader of China most often recognized by the rest of the world, at least excluding the Soviet Union. To be sure, not all the warlords were defeated. Those warlords in Guangxi were still in charge, and there were a couple of others who controlled various provinces. But after 1928, they weren't in open conflict with the Kuomintang government. Chiang tolerated them so long as they generally behaved themselves. Still, this marks the end of what we call the warlord period. You may wonder what the communists were doing during all of this. After the massacres in Shanghai and other places, usually called the White Terror, various communist leaders fanned out through the countryside, raising revolts and trying to establish Soviets in various places. One of the most well-known of these attempts was called the Autumn Harvest Uprising, and it was led by Mao Zedong, who tried to rally the area's peasant farmers to rise up against the landlords and declare a Hunan Soviet. The communists were organizing their own army to defend what bits of territory they had. As we'll see soon enough, there were constant clashes with nationalist armies. With regard to the Autumn Harvest Uprising, which is a representative example, KMT forces came into Hunan and killed, by some estimates, over 300,000 people. Mao and other communist leaders were forced to retreat into the mountains. There's lots more that I could say about what was going on in this period on both the nationalist and communist sides. But let's turn back to Manchuria for a moment. On September 18, 1931, an explosion damaged railroad tracks along the South Manchuria Railway. Lest you think this was a huge dramatic event, it wasn't. The damage to the tracks was so slight, in fact, that 10 minutes after the blast, another train passed over the damaged section without any incident. Nevertheless, the Japanese believed, or wanted people to believe, that Chinese had done it. The result was a full-scale Japanese invasion of Manchuria. This was not a decision made by the Japanese government. In fact, the point was for the Japanese military to bully the government, which was still nominally a democracy at that time, into doing what they wanted. If the military went ahead and invaded Manchuria, the army figured, the politicians in Tokyo would have to back them, or else they'd look weak and divided. It worked. This was one of several incidents, including coups and assassinations, whereby the Japanese military insinuated itself into the government of Japan, eventually controlling it entirely. The Japanese were to become an increasingly big problem in China, as we'll see, but leaders like Chiang Kai-shek viewed them at this point as more of a distraction than an existential threat. The 1927 split between the KMT and the communists set up the dynamic for the next 20 years. As big as China was, it wasn't big enough for the two of these parties. Each of them was determined to destroy the other, however long it took. Let's take a brief break, because I want to tell you a bit about my own relationship to this subject. More than 30 years ago, in late August 1991, I walked into this classroom, the very one you're looking at now, on the campus of the University of New Mexico, for a history course I'd signed up for called Revolutionary China. The professor was Dr. Jonathan Porter, whom I knew nothing about. He was a thin, soft-spoken man whom I liked immediately. The course caught my eye in the catalog because a few years earlier, as a teenager, I had seen and been enthralled by the film The Last Emperor, a biopic about the last Qing ruler, Puyi. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1987. A lot of my early interest in history was fired by movies. An even more formative one for me was Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which I made a video about in 2022. Anyway, I found Dr. Porter's account of China's tumultuous 20th century far more riveting than any movie, and immediately I was hooked. I became a huge fan of Dr. Porter, and I took a class from him every single semester remaining in my undergraduate career. I was a history major, but I chose Asian Studies as my minor, specifically so I could take more of Dr. Porter's classes. I didn't know it at the time, but I was then well on my way to a career as a historian. During the making of my last video on Brazil in the World Wars, I discovered that Dr. Porter had died. It happened some time ago, in 2024, in fact. I was not in contact with him, but I Googled his name once a year or so, always breathing a sigh of relief not to find an obituary. One day, that streak of good luck came to an end. Dr. Porter was 86. He passed away on his ranch near Santa Fe, surrounded by family. In the days after I discovered his obituary, I kept thinking about those times more than 30 years ago. His inspiring classes, long nights in my dorm room, and the library reading Chinese history. Dr. Porter lit a fire of inspiration in me that's the kind of intellectual flame that can burn for a person's entire life. This is what great teachers do. They kindle fires in people and inspire them to do their own learning, their own study, their own immersion into the deep understanding of a subject. I decided for my next video to return to the subject that he taught me in this classroom so many years ago as a tribute to him. Jonathan Porter was an amazing man, and his family was quite illustrious. His father, Elliot Porter, was a famous nature photographer, a contemporary of Ansel Adams. Elliot moved his young family from Boston to New Mexico just after World War II. Amazingly, Jonathan Porter's first degree was in astronomy. That was in the early 1960s. But he found himself fascinated by Chinese history, and when he went to graduate school, he switched to that discipline, earning his PhD from Berkeley in 1971. He served as head of the Department of History at the University of New Mexico for many years. He co-authored some books of photography with his father and several books of his own, one of which was a source used for the making of this video, and another which may inspire a future video. He retired in 2011. I want to thank Dr. Jonathan Porter for his scholarship, his passion, his kindness, his dedication, and above all, for that spark of inspiration that he gave me so many years ago, which, as I hope you see by watching this video, has never gone out. My sympathies are with his family and everyone who remembers him. He was a remarkable man and a gifted educator. This video is dedicated to him. An event known as the Long March is absolutely central to the narrative that the Chinese Communist Party tells about itself and the founding of its regime. After he got into power, Mao encouraged celebration and valorization of the Long March experience, not coincidentally, because it was the event that cemented Mao's influence over the party after a period he was out of favor. In the second half of the 20th century, communist leaders in China would boast that they had been on the Long March or were somehow involved in it. Deng Xiaoping, for instance. So it's pretty important. Nevertheless, I'm not going to get super fine-grained on my retelling of it. That's partly because it's largely a military story, the pins on maps type of history. That's not my strong suit, and which I generally don't like to do. So, like a couple of things that we've already covered, this is a bit of a simplification. In 1930 and 31, Chiang Kai-shek had two main problems. Obviously, one was the Japanese, who were running wild up there in Manchuria, and people were starting to ask, "Hey Chang, what are you going to do about that?" The second was that he had to defeat, absorb, or otherwise neutralize the rest of the warlords. The communist insurgencies were sort of a rock in his shoe, distracting him from taking care of these problems. On November 30th, 1931, in response to the Japanese invasion, Chang said this, quote, "To expel the foreign threat, we must first pacify the country internally, and with unity we can withstand humiliation. There has never been a disunited country able to defeat an external enemy. Therefore, today's external threat cannot be defeated either militarily or diplomatically if we do not first seek domestic unity. Otherwise, we cannot succeed." End quote. What did this mean? Well, it was simple. wipe out the communists first, then do something about the remaining warlords, then tackle the problem of what to do about the Japanese. There were those in China who disagreed with this priority list, as you'll see, but it's vital to understand that wiping out the commies was the first thing that Chang thought about when he got up in the morning and the last thing he thought about when he went to bed. To this end, between late 1931 and the fall of 1934, the KMT armies engaged in various operations to crush the communists. These are usually called encirclements, a military term. There were 5 of them. I don't think I need to go into the details, only the result. By October 1934, most of the communist forces were penned up here in Jiangxi, where they had established a Soviet, but a battle with KMT troops left them vulnerable there. So they decided to join up with other communist armies lying to the southwest and possibly another group they thought was stable in Hubei, which is here. The problem, to get to either of those places, they would have to cross through harsh mountainous territory in western China under fire from Chang's forces much of the time. Since the alternative was annihilation, they decided to go for it. It's important to note that Mao was out of favor at this time. Remember that autumn harvest uprising I mentioned? Well, the leaders of the Communist Party, a man called Bo Gu, was general secretary at this time. Anyway, they weren't too happy with Mao's performance during that mishegas, and in fact, they demoted him and kicked him out of the Politburo for a while. But Mao was in charge politically of the Jiangxi Soviet, disastrously so, since he devoted a lot of energy to purging and killing tens of thousands of class traitors in the area the Soviet controlled, even aside from the death toll of attacks by the KMT. Long story short, thanks to Zhou Enlai, the military planner, communist forces from Jiangxi escaped the noose Chiang was trying to tighten on them and began marching west. There were significant disagreements as to which route they should take, and about everything really, principally why the Chinese communists were getting clowned so badly all across the country. In January 1935, the Chinese Red Army took over a town called Zunyi, which is here. On January 15th, the communist leadership held a big meeting at this house. All the top communists were there, including Mao, Zhou, Bo Gu, and Bo's handler from the Comintern, a German communist named Otto Braun, who many Chinese communists blamed for the decisions that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. Through oratory and skillful politicking, which he was very good at, Mao Zedong outmaneuvered his rivals in the Politburo and got them to adopt more or less his ideas on how the rest of the Long March should go. What this meant was that Bo Gu's influence waned sharply, and even more significantly, the Cominterns did too. The Chinese Communist Party was no longer just an appendage of Moscow and Stalin, and now Mao and his allies were much more firmly in charge. In simpler terms, Mao used the Long March crisis to increase his own power and leadership over the party. It sort of worked and sort of didn't. The Long March was ultimately successful in a sense, but the Chinese Red Army continued to lose lots of men and many battles along the way. This is called the Luding Bridge in Sichuan province. In May 1935, a battle occurred here between the Red Army, units under the command of Lin Biao, later a very important official in the PRC, and local warlords loyal to Chiang Kai-shek. Exactly how big this battle was, or whether it was really much of a battle at all, has been disputed. Chinese communist propaganda inflated the reputation of the Luding Bridge incident into a heroic story of sacrifice and victory. The reality may be that it wasn't very important at all, but certainly this bridge is revered in the Communist Party's telling of its own history. On October 22, 1936, a year after the beginning of the operation, Mao's forces linked up with 2 other Communist Red Army units in Shaanxi province near Yan'an, a defensible place given its remoteness and the harshness of the territory. He started out with 100,000 troops. About 8,000 made it to Yan'an. Despite the spin that the Communist Party put on it, the Long March was not really a military victory, unless you count mere survival as victory, which some clearly did. But it absolutely was a political victory, particularly from Mao Zedong, who now had the most important reputation in the party. While so much has been written about it, not a lot of it reliable, the basic importance of the Long March to the broader story of this video is generally pretty simple. Chiang and the KMT were about to wipe out the communists, but they managed to escape to Yan'an, and Mao Zedong used this event to bolster his influence in the party. The communists, as we'll see, used their long hiatus in Yan'an to rebuild themselves and plan for their ultimate conquest of China. It was the seed of the Communist Party's ultimate victory in the Civil War in 1949. This is all I think I need to say about the Long March. Let's turn our attention away from the communists for a little while and look at what was going on in the rest of China during the critical and tragic decade of the 1930s. I've spent most of the time in this video on the political story of China since 1900. I think it's worth spending a few minutes talking about what else was going on in this period. China was undergoing an incredible amount of change in the first decades of the 20th century. There's no way it couldn't be that way. After thousands of years of dynastic rule, suddenly popping out into a modern world of telephones, airplanes, and civil rights for people previously deemed irrelevant to society was bound to have a major impact on how everyday Chinese people lived their lives. Many old traditions in China faded away quickly. Earlier I mentioned foot binding, which was banned by the Dowager Empress Cixi in the last years of imperial rule. This had a huge impact on the women of China, who previously had been kept silent, cloistered, and often functionally immobile as a result of the incredibly patriarchal system of Confucian social relations and the rigid traditions of yesteryear. Feminists had been active in China since before the 1911 revolution, but their causes took on new relevance as the imperial order collapsed. Tang Chunying founded the Women's Suffrage Alliance in 1912, which fought to get the franchise for women enshrined in China's new constitution. That failed at first. The new rulers of China, particularly Yuan Shikai, were hostile to the idea of women's participation in politics. But women were moving into the public sphere in a number of ways. One example was Zhang Youyi, the first woman banker in the Republic of China, who founded the Shanghai Women's Savings Bank. Zhang Youyi was also involved in the first legal divorce granted under the new laws of Republican China, when she dissolved her marriage to poet Zhu Jimo. That was in 1922. By that time, women had begun to study at Chinese universities, and they were also gaining financial freedom from their husbands or male relatives. Much of this was part of something called the New Culture movement, which arose in China in the 19-teens and 20s and sought to provide progressive alternatives to the stifling conservative Confucian culture that had been the rule in China for centuries. The New Culture movement, which I mentioned before, was linked to the May 4th movement. I talked about that story in Chapter 5. A number of writers were contributing a new strain in modern Chinese literature, which also sought to embrace modernity and criticize the excesses of Confucian society. For example, in my Revolutionary China class back in 1991 that I mentioned earlier, Dr. Porter assigned us to read some of the work of novelist Ba Jin, an anarchist, whose most famous novel, Family, was first published in 1931. Amazingly, Ba Jin was still alive when I read that book for the first time. He lived into this century, dying in 2005. Other major writers of this period included Shen Kongwen, virtually unknown in the West, who wrote Border Town and Long River and was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. And although not of the stature that was likely to win Nobel Prizes, but at least an author that some people in the West are likely to have heard of, there was Wang Dulu, who wrote many novels in the 1930s and 1940s, focusing on the adventures of martial artists. Wang Dulu's books had flowery titles like Precious Sword, Golden Hairpin, Iron Knight, Silver Vase, and the one you probably have heard of, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, written under incredible circumstances during World War II, and which was made into an utterly smashing film by Ang Lee in the year 2000. Despite all the war and turmoil going on in this period, China could be a fun and cosmopolitan place to be. Shanghai in the 1930s was regarded as the Paris of the East. The Shanghai International Settlement, the enclave of foreigners that had been there since just after the Opium Wars, was sort of an alternate universe of lavish mansions and upper-class parties. And it wasn't just foreigners. Over 1 million Chinese lived within the settlement too. Outside of it, Shanghai had an incredibly vibrant nightclub and cabaret culture that peaked in the mid to late 1930s, with dance halls and ballrooms being a particular highlight. Shanghai's dance club culture, comparable in some ways to the nightclub culture of Weimar-era Germany just before the Nazis came to power, is a fascinating subject of study by scholar Andrew David Field, who I mention because he happens to be a fellow YouTuber, though he does mostly music stuff on his channel. The bottom line was that China was a very complex and vibrant country during this entire period. The revolution of 1911 had unleashed a great mass of forces, political, cultural, literary, musical, artistic, that totally reshaped this very ancient and traditional society into a modern multicultural one. I think this is important to keep in mind as we continue through the thicket of political developments. To many people, the fact that a large piece of China, Manchuria, had been taken over and occupied by the Japanese was the most alarming thing. After their invasion in September 1931, the Japanese established a puppet government, a largely fake country they called Manchukuo. I say it's mostly a fake country because it didn't really do any of the things that most nation-states are supposed to do. It was essentially a front for the large-scale theft of northern China's resources by the Japanese: minerals, lumber, labor, and cash. The Japanese tried to put a Chinese face on this criminal enterprise by establishing Puyi, the deposed Qing emperor, as the new emperor of Manchukuo. Now an adult, Puyi, who was considerably more perverse and far less sympathetic a personality than he was made out to be in the 1987 biopic of his life, was put up as Manchukuo's emperor in 1932. He had no real power and was a total stooge of the Japanese. The shenanigans in Manchuria cost Japan its membership in the League of Nations, which they didn't care very much about anyway. Unfortunately, Manchukuo also became the base for further Japanese aggression in China, which I'll talk about in a minute, and also a number of horrific atrocities, which I can only cover in any depth in the members section version of this video. Chiang Kai-shek's prioritizing of wiping out the communists before doing anything substantive to resist Japan's aggression came back to haunt him. Many people in China realized that the nationalists and communists, however much they hated each other, were going to have to work together to kick out the Japanese. The communists themselves recognized this. In August 1936, even before the Long March was over, the party issued an open letter in which they rescinded their program of opposition to the KMT at every turn and called for joining together with them to defeat the Japanese. The communists even officially dropped their aim to establish a Soviet republic in China, changing the wording of what they wanted to establish to read, quote, a democratic republic. In simpler terms, they and others were proposing another united front. Chang was not totally intransigent. In fact, he sent secret envoys to try to negotiate with the communists behind the scenes, and he also sent envoys to Moscow, hoping to get the Soviet Union back on his side. But he insisted that Moscow tell the communists to pledge allegiance to the KMT. The Russians refused to do this, and negotiations reached an impasse. Then, in December 1936, some warlords nominally allied with Chang and the KMT took matters into their own hands. One of them was Zhang Zuiliang, the son of the late Zhang Zuolin. The other was Yang Husheng. At Xi'an, the ancient imperial capital, these warlords induced Chiang Kai-shek's bodyguards to kidnap him. The kidnapped attempt occurred in this room at a spa hotel in Xi'an. After a brief firefight, Chiang jumped out the window and ran to a hill behind the resort, but slipped and fell and hurt his back. Zhang Zuiliang's goons caught up with him and captured him. The idea was to force Chang into negotiations with the communists and form this new united front to resist the Japanese. However, Zhang Zuiliang was shocked when the communists, who he thought would welcome the capture and arrest of their arch-enemy, demanded that he release him. The demand came from Stalin himself, who feared that if Chiang was killed or deposed, the next Kuomintang leader might make a deal with the Japanese, which could set up China as a base for a Japanese invasion of the Soviet Union. Negotiations with various interested parties, including Zhou Enlai, went down at Zhang Zuiliang's house. This is the scene as recreated with mannequins by the museum that the site has since been turned into. It happened on Christmas Eve, 1936. The result was essentially a ceasefire in the Chinese Civil War. Chiang would accept a deal with the communists, which came to be known as the Second United Front, and communist Red Army units would be assimilated into the KMT army, at least in name. In reality, they continued to act independently, but at least they weren't shooting at each other. This, plus the communist entrenchment in Yan'an, ensured their survival and indeed their prosperity during the war with the Japanese that was to come. As for Zhang Zuiliang, the architect of the plot, after the negotiations were over, he agreed to fly to Nanjing, the KMT capital, as a showing to Chang that there were no hard feelings. Turns out there were. Chang turned the tables. As soon as his plane landed, Chiang had Zhang Zuiliang arrested. He was given a quick trial and found guilty. Chiang Kai-shek pardoned him in early January 1937, but on the condition that he, Zhang Zuiliang, remain under house arrest, which he did until, if you can believe it, 1988. The Nationalists even took him with them when they fled to Taiwan in 1949. This is the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. Originally built in the Middle Ages, it was restored to this appearance during the early Qing dynasty in the late 1600s. It gets its name from being mentioned prominently in the accounts of medieval Venetian traveler Marco Polo back in the 13th century. On the night of July 7, 1937, private in the Japanese army, Shimura Kikujiro, went AWOL. There were numerous Japanese forces in the area, mostly patrolling the railroads, which, as you recall, they had the right to control. The Japanese unit suspected Shimura had been killed or kidnapped by Chinese forces. In reality, he may have gone off to a brothel. He soon came back to his unit. In any event, shots were fired between Chinese and Japanese forces, which flared into a full-scale battle for this bridge. The Chinese held it barely. You should know by now that the Japanese were keen to jump on any excuse to tear off more pieces of Chinese territory. This, however, was the big one. Within a few weeks, Japanese forces had begun a full-scale invasion of the rest of China. This was the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, though you could make a case that Japan had been at war in China at least since 1931. This was also the war that both the KMT and the communists had anticipated. It was also a conflict that changed the world. The grisly story of it is the subject of the next chapter. The conflict that entered this new phase in July 1937 is generally known in China as the War of Resistance. Even Chinese historians disagree on what should be considered its beginning, 1931 or 1937, or its relationship to the larger Second World War that broke out elsewhere on the globe in various stages over the next 4 years. What's indisputable is that this war was one of the most vicious and tragic conflicts in modern history. Its scope and the scale of the suffering it inflicted on people in East Asia is almost unfathomable. Because Chiang Kai-shek had been dinking around trying to round up the communists and neutralize the few warlords that still opposed him, he and the KMT government were totally unprepared for full-scale war. This is absolutely inexcusable and an illustration of Chiang's failure as a leader. He had literally years to prepare and plenty of warning, but he was still stuck in the Warlord Era. While the fighting was hard and brutal, the Chinese were generally poor at resisting Japanese advances, at least in a strategic sense. You can understand why. The Japanese utilized air power to a much greater degree than Chiang anticipated or could cope with. China's troops were accustomed to fighting battles within their own country against warlords and communists, but not against the well-trained and extremely aggressive Japanese attack forces. In August 1937, the Japanese threw 300,000 troops into the effort to capture Shanghai. They did. Notably, they left the Shanghai International Settlement alone. Remember that. It becomes important later. With Shanghai in their pocket, the next target was the nationalist capital, Nanjing. The assault began in November 1937. The Japanese won this one too, and now we get into the extremely grim subject of what happened after that. The short version: the Japanese killed about 200,000 people, more or less, most of them civilians, in the most brutal and horrible ways imaginable. I want to say two things about this. First, a discussion of what happened in Nanjing in December 1937 is simply not possible on the free version of my channel because it can't be done within YouTube's ad-friendly guidelines, which means this video would be demonetized and I would not get paid for my very extensive work in putting it together. Consequently, the material on the Nanjing massacre appears in the version of this video in the members section. Second, some people deny that the Nanjing massacre took place or contend that the details and the death toll are greatly exaggerated. This is absolutely wrong. It did happen, and it was just as bad as the estimates say it was. Denial of the Nanjing massacre or Japanese atrocities in the World War II era in general is every bit as evil as Holocaust denial. So if you are one of those people who deny the Nanjing massacre, here's what I want you to do. Stop watching this video right now. Go sit down, think about the horrible choices you've made in your life, and never, ever watch my channel again. I don't want you in my audience. Period. End of story. Okay, member section, let's get into it. For the free channel version, we're going to move on. Chiang Kai-shek's response to the Japanese victories of 1937 and early 1938 was monstrous. In June 1938, he gave the authorization to blow up levees along the Yellow River, hoping the floodwaters would push back the Japanese armies that were preparing to attack a key railway from Beijing to Wuhan. This man-made disaster swept away tens of thousands of acres of farmland and killed hundreds of thousands of people, possibly as many as 500,000, factoring in the follow-on effects such as famine and disease that swept the flood-stricken region. For as often as they were successful in individual engagements and campaigns, the Japanese didn't really have a strategy to win the war they had started. They just sort of hoped that the KMT government would cave in. It didn't. After Nanjing and Wuhan fell, Chang moved his capital to Chongqing in a mountainous area in southwestern China, where the terrain and environmental conditions made it difficult to attack. This remained the KMT capital for the rest of World War II. All of this fighting stirred up a tremendous amount of movement within China. Millions of refugees took to the roads and the countryside, fleeing the Japanese or the nationalists or the communists or all three. Families were separated and there was a tremendous amount of social dislocation. When the Japanese offensives bogged down in 1939, they ramped up bombing raids on the major cities they didn't already control. The whole country was just a mess. By 1940, the Kuomintang was starting to lose its grip. There weren't that many more people Chang could conscript into his army. Food supplies were running low because so much farmland had been destroyed or farm labor killed or conscripted. Inflation started to run very high. Even many people who had once supported the nationalist government were fed up with it. Chiang Kai-shek had never seemed especially committed to the democratic principles he said the KMT stood for, and his rule was increasingly authoritarian. In the 1930s, he had even started a faction within the Kuomintang called the Blue Shirts Society, which modeled itself in some respects after Mussolini's Black Shirts. The KMT was not a fascist party by any reasonable definition, but neither was it particularly democratic. Unfortunately, at the time of the Japanese invasions, China was pretty much stuck with it. Even the communists conceded that. China's fortunes were deeply affected in late 1941 by yet another Japanese attack, but this time the attack wasn't on them. Japan's offensive across the Pacific, which began with the raid on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, set up how the rest of the global conflict was going to play out. It would prove pivotal for China. That story is in the next chapter. Americans tend to focus, understandably so, on the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor as a pivotal moment in history. It was, but it was much larger than just Pearl Harbor. When Japanese planes began bombing the U.S. Navy base at Hawaii on the morning of December 7, 1941, an entire offensive was primed to launch, with numerous targets in the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and China. The raid on Pearl Harbor was just the first blow. On December 7th and 8th, 1941, Japanese forces were on the move everywhere. The key to the whole plan was snapping up the East Indies, now Indonesia, then colonies of the Dutch, because the Japanese could get oil there. The FDR administration had embargoed Japan in the summer of 1941, largely to try to pressure them to withdraw from China. And the United States had formerly been Japan's #1 supplier of oil and scrap metal, two commodities they absolutely needed to keep the Chinese war going. But now that they were directly at war with the major colonial powers, the US, Netherlands, and Britain, the Japanese seized their chance to finish their conquest of Shanghai. Remember I said that they left the Shanghai International Settlement mostly alone when they took over Shanghai in 1937. On December 8, 1941, Japanese troops invaded it. Many of the hundreds of thousands of Chinese who lived there tried to flee. The foreigners, except the French, who were technically subjects of the Nazis, or at least Nazi puppet states, were rounded up and put in a concentration camp called the Lunghua Civilian Assembly Center. This is it, or what's left of it, now on the grounds of Shanghai High School, now regarded as one of the best high schools in China. Few outward signs remain of the suffering that went on here during the war, though conditions were considerably better at Lunghua than in military prison camps, because the Japanese military code held that prisoners who surrendered to them were disgraced and dishonored, and thus deserved terrible treatment. The experience of being a prisoner at Lunghua, especially seen through the eyes of children, was documented in an autobiographical book by British author J.G. Ballard, who was interned here as a teenager. That book was made into a film, Empire of the Sun, in 1987 by Steven Spielberg, one of his lesser-known works. While they get the essence of the experience right, both the book and the film contain significant inaccuracies. But the picture is worth seeing if you want to get a sense of what World War II era China looked and felt like, at least for foreigners. Also on December 8, 1941, the Japanese made a move toward Hong Kong, the colony the British had occupied since the end of the First Opium War in 1842. This is the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong. Here, on the third floor of this building, on December 26, 1941, the British colonial governor, Mark Aitchison Young, formally surrendered Hong Kong to the Japanese. This began 3.5 years of Japanese occupation, which was marked, as customary for them, by privation, low rations, executions, and various other war crimes. Now, I realize the way I've talked about Japanese occupations of parts of China up till now, I might have given the impression that the Chinese who were occupied were somehow passive or that they had no agency. Obviously, that's not true. They resisted strongly and tenaciously. There were numerous resistance armies in China fighting the Japanese the whole time. Some of the most ferocious resistance was in Manchuria beginning in 1931. As you recall, the Manchus had started out as semi-nomadic hunters and warriors, and that tradition stood them in good stead during the Resistance War. Militias and bandits wreaked havoc against the Japanese. A general called Ding Zhao was a thorn in the side of the Japanese until he was defeated in 1932. There were others like Wang Delin and his People's National Salvation Army, Tong Jiewu, the Red Spear Society, the Big Sword Society, the infamous Ma Zhanshan. I don't know if those are dreadlocks he's sporting there, but if so, awesome. Anyway, there was resistance everywhere. In Hong Kong, there was an army of irregulars called the Dongjiang, or East River Column, that hassled the Japanese throughout the occupation. This army was associated with the Chinese Communist Party, which also conducted other resistance operations against the Japanese, and occasionally fought small-scale battles against Kuomintang troops too. You just can't keep these guys from fighting each other. Even some Japanese who disagreed with their government's aggressive policies turned coat and collaborated with the Chinese resistance. Some of these were communist-affiliated too, such as Sanso Nosaka, who encouraged Japanese soldiers captured by the Chinese to join up with the Chinese Communist Party and fight the Japanese occupiers. If we talk about Japanese occupation of parts of China, we have to talk about Unit 731. This is unfortunately another topic that I simply can't do on the free channel version of this video because of ad-friendly guidelines and potential demonetization. So, as with the Nanjing Massacre subject, I'm going to cover it on the members section version. And for the rest of you, what you need to know is this. The Japanese ran a secret facility in Manchuria dedicated to researching biological and chemical weapons. The atrocities they committed there are among the worst in the entire World War II era. The United States was complicit after the fact by covering up what had happened with Unit 731 and shielding Japanese who participated in it. There is evidence that knowledge of the unit and its activities went right to the top, including General Douglas MacArthur, and American authorities who occupied Japan at the end of the war granted immunity to the main participants in exchange for their documents, which the Americans hoped might be useful in researching biological weapons to counter potential development of them by the Soviet Union. There is no question that China was one of the many countries that suffered horribly under fascist domination during the World War II era. During these years, Hitler's Holocaust was going on in Europe, resulting in the deaths of about 6 million Jews, as well as other enemies of the Nazi state. But it's undeniable that what has been termed the Asian Holocaust was going on at the same time, not just in China, obviously, but the epicenter of these horrors was certainly focused on China, as that was the main strategic goal of the Japanese in the war. They saw dominating China as the destiny of their people, much as the Nazis viewed the conquest of Russia, which they hoped to dominate, in the same way. Millions of Chinese, most of them civilians, pay the ultimate price for this twisted and racist vision. I think I've said enough about this topic. In the next chapter, we'll turn to a broader and more strategic type of look at World War II and how it involved China, which many people in the West forget was a major member of the Allies. To most Americans in World War II, China was one letter in an acronym that was thrown around in military jargon, the CBI theater, with CBI meaning China, Burma, and India, that really understates China's contribution to the Second World War. I've done a lot on my channel recently about showcasing the experiences of countries that you don't often think of as having a big part in the world wars, like Mexico and Brazil. The purpose of this video is not to rehabilitate China's reputation as a major player in the war, but the broader global conflict did affect China and vice versa. As you know, China had been fighting Japan since 1931, and it literally took 10 years before the Chinese started to see significant tangible help from other countries who claimed they were their allies. Though it's not fair to say that Franklin Roosevelt suddenly discovered China was a potential ally when the U.S. went to war against Japan in late 1941, American involvement with the Chinese was, until then, limited mostly to specialists and far-seeing strategists. One of those was General Joseph Stilwell, who I'll return to in a few moments. Another American who was significantly involved with China and heavily shaped the U.S.-Chinese relationship was a journalist, Edgar Snow. He first traveled to China in the 1920s, knew and hobnobbed with Chiang Kai-shek and his circle, and urged U.S. support for the Kuomintang government. Then, in 1936, just as the Long March was ending, Snow was able to visit the communist enclave in Yan'an, thanks to the intercession of Zhang Zhuiliang, remember him. This was just before the Xi'an incident. Snow spent quite some time at Yan'an, and his writings that emerged from that experience spun a fascinating and indeed captivating look at the Chinese Communist Party in exile. Snow's reporting, and particularly his lengthy interviews with Mao Zedong, painted a picture of the communists as romantic revolutionaries, fighting the good fight and preparing for the day that they would remake China as a socialist paradise. The book that Snow wrote after his return, Red Star Over China, published in 1937, was a bestseller in the West and is responsible for enshrining a certain image of Mao in popular culture. You will find Red Star Over China in the list of sources I used to make this video. Doesn't mean I agree with Snow's fairly obvious spin, but it is a classic of Chinese history in this area and a significant primary source document. Dr. Porter had us read it in his class. It's really a great read, but take it with a few grains of salt. This does raise the question, what were the communists doing all this time? Well, they were marshaling their resources for what they viewed as their inevitable takeover of China once the war with the Japanese was over. By 1945, the communists were entrenched, not just in Yan'an, but they had a chain of 15 bases across various parts of China, ready and waiting to resume the Civil War. Despite being ostensibly part of the Second United Front, the communists did not engage the Japanese in more than a handful of large battles. They mostly left the fighting to Chiang and the KMT. There was a campaign called the 100 Regiments Offensive against Japanese troops in 1940, but beyond this, it was mostly small-scale guerrilla operations, which they did do a lot of. Within areas the communists controlled, they were up to their usual tricks: land reorganization, putting wealthy landlords on trial, and purges. The World War II era was the first time we hear of a concept called Mao Zedong thought, which is exactly what it sounds like: party and ideological orthodoxy straight from the mind, mouth, and pen of the very communist leader that Edgar Snow had romanticized and publicized in Red Star Over China. Mao purged political and ideological enemies who were not to his liking. An example is a writer named Wang Shiwei, a communist who was pretty passionate about the movement, but who made the mistake of writing an essay where he mentioned that Mao went to bed with a lot of sexy women. Mao made sure Wang was expelled from the party in 1942, and he was later murdered, possibly on Mao's orders. In the meantime, Chiang Kai-shek was milking his relationship with the United States for all it was worth. FDR needed China to keep fighting, as the KMT was holding down large numbers of Japanese troops that would otherwise have been shooting at Americans in the Pacific. Remember Chiang's wife, Sung Mei-ling? Speaking English fluently and with lots of upper-class friends in America, she toured the U.S. during the war years, drumming up financial and political support for her husband's regime. The Western press loved her. She even spoke to a joint session of Congress in 1943. Joseph Stilwell was another of Chiang's great American assets. He commanded all American forces in the CBI, China, Burma, India theater, and was the point man for funneling U.S. Lend-Lease supplies to Chiang and the KMT. Despite this, though, his relationship with Chiang was acrimonious, and the two often disagreed and resented each other. Stillwell called Chiang Kai-shek the peanut, which you have to admit is kind of apposite. Stillwell was frustrated that Chiang was stockpiling Lend-Lease supplies, presumably for the purpose of waging war against the communists once the Pacific War ended. Whatever they were destined for, American supplies regularly made their way into China, many across the Hump. This was an air route from British-controlled India across the Himalayas, flown mostly by American and British air forces. This part of the war is pretty famous, and it was extremely dangerous. Flying a C-47 full of explosives over the Himalayas in winter is not quite the definition of a suicide mission, but obviously extremely dangerous. In May 1944, the Japanese launched a counterattack in China called Operation No. 1, or Ichigo. The idea was to take territory to fill in the gaps of the areas that the Japanese control, and hopefully to eliminate U.S. air bases in China from which they could fly bombers over Japan. Despite it being late in the war, Ichigo actually went pretty well for the Japanese. But most importantly, it sapped Chiang and the KMT armies of much of their strength, which may have been decisive, or at least relevant, to why they would eventually lose the Civil War against the communists. This is Levadia Palace at Yalta in the Crimea, Russia. It should be in the country of Ukraine, but Putin stole it in 2014. Once a vacation home for the Tsars, Yalta is now most famous as the venue for the meeting of the three major Allied leaders: Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, which occurred in February 1945. Indeed, one of the most famous photos of World War II, of the Big Three as they were called, was taken right here at this location. Yalta comes in about the second or third to last chapter in nearly every story about World War II. I don't need to go into all the world-shaking decisions made there, many at the expense of FDR, who was dying at the time. But one that directly concerns China was an agreement made with Stalin that the Soviet Union would enter the Pacific War against Japan 3 months after combat operations ended in Europe. This deal is crucial to China's post-World War II history. By the time that deadline ran, FDR was pushing up daisies at Hyde Park, and his successor Truman really wished he hadn't made that deal. Stalin indeed entered the war right on time on August 8, 1945, with a huge invasion of Manchuria. Just 2 days earlier, on August 6th, Truman had dropped the first atomic bomb on Japan. The second bomb on Nagasaki fell on August 9th, as Soviet troops were flooding into the collapsing Japanese joke state of Manchukuo. The campaign lasted only about 10 days, but its effects were immense. Stalin had stayed out of the war with Japan after a conflict between Soviet and Japanese forces along their common land borders in 1939, a topic I covered in my video on August 1939. But the lightning invasion left Soviet troops occupying Manchuria and part of Korea when the music stopped on August 14th, the date the Japanese emperor announced the country would accept surrender terms. The Soviets stripped factories and other assets that the Japanese left behind, most looted from the Chinese themselves, and took some of it back to Russia, and also gave some of that equipment, particularly weapons, to the communists. And the Soviet occupation of the northern half of Korea would result in them putting in a communist dictator, Kim Il-sung, the founder of the fanatical North Korean dynasty that continues down to the present day. Kim Jong-un is Kim Il-sung's grandson. The fact that World War II in the Pacific and Asia ended so suddenly with the atomic bombs left Chiang Kai-shek scrambling. He was always a day late and a dollar short, and with the sudden coming of peace in 1945, he had no time and had made no plans for a transition to a post-war world that would leave him and the KMT in any kind of shape to resist the communists. Remember that Japanese offensive I mentioned, Ichigo? That drained the KMT of a lot of its military hardware and personnel. They had lost control of China's economy. Inflation was terrible, and the communists were a lot stronger than they were. Just to put it in perspective, let's crunch some numbers and compare situations in 1937, when the Resistance War began, to 1945, when it ended. Mao and the communists started with a tiny enclave of about 35,000 square miles, 92,000 square kilometers, with 1.5 million people in the year after the Long March. By 1945, they had 348,000 square miles, 900,000 square kilometers, with over 100 million people. In 1937, the Communist Party had about 40,000 men under arms. In 1945, they had over 1 million, plus 2 million more militia they could call up at any time. They achieved all of this during World War II, while the Japanese were inflicting heavy losses on Mao's archenemy, Chiang Kai-shek, and the Nationalists. To be sure, he wasn't out of the game, though. He still controlled most of South China, where the bulk of China's population and arable land were, and only some of it had been damaged during the Japanese occupation. His friends, the United States, occupied southern Korea and held Japan as a conquered province. There were even some American troops in China proper, particularly U.S. Marines, tasked to make sure Japanese forces withdrew from the country. But you can sort of liken the end of World War II in Asia to a game of musical chairs. As the music stopped somewhat earlier than expected, all the major players scrambled to get a good seat. Stalin and the Soviets got basically a whole sofa. The US was positioned around the edges. Mao and the communists, as we saw, got a really good seat. And Chiang Kai-shek, though not entirely without a chair, had a whole lot less to show for his sacrifices in the war than he would have liked to. I think it's important to conceptualize it this way, because the Chinese Civil War that erupted in 1946 and its outcome depended heavily on how much the major players started with and where their holdings were. World War II, or the Resistance War, or the Pacific War, or whatever you want to call it, was for China a period of arranging pieces on the board for what was to be the final stretch of the game, at least as between the KMT and the communists. In this final stretch was the conclusion of the long Chinese Revolution. That is in the next chapter. To be sure, the Chinese Civil War didn't break out immediately upon the end of the conflict with the Japanese. There was sort of an uneasy peace during the last few months of 1945 and beginning of 1946. There were even negotiations between the KMT and the Communist Party. Chang and the KMT were drawing up a new constitution for China, and the parties tried to negotiate on what China would look like going forward. Zhou Enlai was the chief negotiator for the communists. But both sides were intransigent. The KMT insisted on a one-party state. The communists wanted pluralism, or said they did, ironic because they themselves instituted a one-party state when they took over in 1949. The KMT also demanded that the communists' army be absorbed into theirs. While you can make an argument that the communists were not negotiating in good faith, the KMT was simply intransigent and inflexible on too many issues. Even George Marshall, U.S. general, who was involved in the negotiations, thought that. A series of incidents, clashes, a political assassination or two, that sort of thing, eventually led to open warfare between the KMT and the communists, which is what most people expected. Chiang Kai-shek launched a major attack against communist areas in the north in July 1946, and the fighting was on. The KMT's strength was in urban areas where the communists held a lot of the countryside and rural areas, which proved to be a decided advantage for them. The KMT also had strength in the south. The way Dr. Porter described the Chinese Civil War to us in his class was to liken it to an ancient Chinese board game called Wei Qi, known more commonly by its Japanese name, Go. This is a game where the object is to put pieces down on the board, usually black and white tiles, to outflank your opponent. That's a pretty good way to think of the overall strategy. I'm not going to go through a laundry list of battles, although a few engagements are worth mentioning. Chang and the KMT managed to capture Yan'an, the communist central hideout during the World War II years, in March 1947. Unfortunately for them, this victory turned out to be not much more than just ceremonial. Most of the KMT's large-scale offensives failed. The communist armies seeped out of the countryside and started taking over cities one by one, tiles in Wei Qi. The more territory they controlled, they could cut off important railways that made it harder for the KMT to coordinate and move their forces around. Mao Zedong was happy to take credit for the military successes of the People's Liberation Army, but he wasn't primarily responsible. He was a political, not a military leader. The successful military campaigns had many architects, most of whom became prominent leaders of Communist China after 1949. One was Zhu De, who had started his career in Yuan Shikai's Beiyang Army and who was later a protege of warlord Kai-shek. Another major architect of victory was a very short fellow called Deng Xiaoping. Mao credited Deng with destroying or capturing 25 KMT Corps, 5 armies, and 56 divisions during the decisive phase of the war between September 1948 and January 1949. The reality of the war on the ground was utterly brutal. Just to give one representative example, in May 1948, the Communist Army, now called the People's Liberation Army, besieged the city of Changchun in Jilin province. In order to force the Kuomintang defenders to stretch their food supplies, the Communists refused to let any civilians leave the city. The siege lasted 5 months. Over 120,000 people literally starved to death. To this day, the Chinese Communist Party officially denies these figures, despite the number 120,000 appearing in a report written by Lin Biao to Mao Zedong. Families were torn apart by the Civil War, as some found themselves in KMT territory and others in communist territory. In some cases, families remain split to this day, having been unable to talk to each other for decades. The social and human cost of the Chinese Civil War was staggering. Having just come out of the horrors of the resistance war against the Japanese, most of the population of China was very war-weary by the end of the 1940s. By the close of 1948, it was pretty clear the communists were going to win. Chiang Kai-shek and his cronies had already been planning an escape to Taiwan, and now those plans had to be put into action. Taiwan, however, was not simply the KMTs to do with as they pleased. The native Taiwanese, who came out of their long nightmare under Japanese rule, hoping for some autonomy and self-determination, didn't necessarily support the nationalists. In February 1947, a riot which started over cigarette taxes flared into a major uprising. The KMT put it down by force. Thousands, possibly as many as 28,000 Taiwanese were killed by Chiang's forces. Meanwhile, a communist action called the Pingjin Campaign saw the Red Armies start to close in on the key cities of Beijing and Tianjin in late 1948. And early 1949. These battles killed over 500,000 people and were a resounding defeat for the KMT. On January 22, 1949, the Kuomintang commander surrendered Beijing to the communists. Several KMT leaders went over to Mao's side. Then the Red Armies made a symbolically and politically significant move by moving their forces across the Yangtze River to attack South China, where what remained of the Kuomintang's armies were strongest. Deng Xiaoping was significantly involved in these operations too. Some observers expected pitched battles, the KMT's last stand, but their strength was really petering out. The nationalist government began to collapse. Chiang Kai-shek resigned as KMT leader, being replaced by Li Zhongren, the vice president. The evacuation had begun in fits and starts in 1948, but really got going in earnest as the final communist offensives began in April 1949. Nanjing fell to them on April 24th. Shanghai would be next. Planes and ships shuttled frantically back and forth between Taiwan and the mainland, ferrying soldiers, weapons, cultural and art treasures, and money to Taiwan, especially money. Chang was careful to make sure that most of the Republic of China's gold reserves and other forms of liquid money were moved to Taiwan. He and his family had embezzled tens of millions of dollars from the government itself, and significantly more from American aid during World War II. All this loot would prove to be the basis of Taiwan's post-war economy. I'm going to say more about corruption in the KMT in just a moment. By May 1949, 5,000 refugees were arriving in Taiwan every day. The fighting on the mainland wasn't over, but Chiang finally realized that the war was lost, and it was hopeless to continue resisting. Taiwan, incidentally, was chosen as the hideout because it was mountainous and extremely defensible. The communists learned just how defensible it was during a battle called the Battle of Guningtou in November 1949, when they tried to invade an island, Kinmen, also known as Quemoy, as a stepping stone to attacking Taiwan. Chiang and his family left the mainland for the last time in December 1949. So why did the Kuomintang lose the Chinese Civil War? Well, there are a number of reasons. The crappy economy was a major one. Hyperinflation had been ravaging China since the early days of World War II, and Chiang's economic policy simply couldn't get it under control. Many people's life savings were simply wiped out just trying to stay alive. The KMT was, as I said a moment ago, incredibly corrupt. Chiang Kai-shek and his family reportedly looted $20 million from China's coffers during the 1930s and 40s. Harry Truman claimed they stole more like $750 million in American aid. People could buy political offices in the nationalist government, and civil servants required bribes to do their basic duties. Now, in part, this was related to the economic crisis. The bureaucrats and office holders had been wiped out by hyperinflation just the same as anyone, so taking bribes was an economic lifeline they could cling to. The leadership of the Kuomintang was also pretty bad. Chiang Kai-shek was never really very sharp as a national leader. By 1947, he and most of the senior leadership of the party had been in power for 20 years, and they really weren't grooming a younger generation of party members for leadership. With the exception of Chiang Kai-shek's son, Zhang Jingguo, who Chang obviously intended to replace him as leader in sort of a quasi-dynastic arrangement. By contrast, the communist program was pretty attractive. The communists enacted land reform in the areas they controlled. In nationalist areas, people were still paying high rents to mostly absentee landlords. Mao could thus frame the Civil War as a class struggle with a clear payoff for people who supported him. They'd be free of debts and rents, and they could stick it to the landowners and rich peasants they had always hated. The land reform actually increased the numbers of communist troops, as thousands of KMT soldiers switched sides to take advantage of the land provisions. After 20 years in power, the Kuomintang had largely failed in its attempts to bring China into a democratic age. By 1949, the grand theories and promises of Sun Yat-sen, way back at the beginning of the century, were in tatters. Chiang Kai-shek now ruled a small island rather than a big country, and Mao, the undisputed victor of the Civil War, could enact his programs on a nationwide level. This was the true Chinese Revolution, the one that began in 1949. Not the one that ended there. Although the war wasn't totally over yet, the communists were functionally in charge of China once they occupied Beijing in the spring of 1949. Mao and his chief lieutenants set about trying to establish the basic institutions of a new national government. Mao himself was kind of a stranger in Beijing, but over a period of a couple of months, he began to settle there. After some hemming and hawing and consideration of a few other sites, the communists eventually chose as their governing compound their version of the Forbidden City, a place called Zhongnanhai. If we go back to the geography of Beijing we saw in Chapter 1, Zhongnanhai is here just to the west of the Forbidden City and a few blocks northwest of Tiananmen Square. This was a complex of lakes and gardens built in the early Ming Dynasty. Chinese rulers have a long history here. Cixi, the Dowager Empress, lived here. So did Yuan Shikai when he was trying to set himself up as emperor. See this island? This is the island where Cixi imprisoned her nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, in 1898 after the 100 Days Reform. It's highly significant, I think, that the communist rulers chose to occupy this complex just the same as many of China's previous rulers did. Mao indeed saw himself as something of a new emperor, of a new dynasty, the Communist Dynasty. Mao Zedong retreated into heavily guarded quarters at Zhongnanhai, where he was essentially closed off from the outside world for the rest of his life. He had a room stocked with books and documents. He read and reread the Chinese classics over and over again for his whole life. And he had a huge bed that was usually cluttered with books. He took a lot of girls to bed there. Mao had a voracious sexual appetite, and government lackeys constantly supplied him with women. In 1994, a controversial book was published by a man called Li Zhisui, Mao's doctor for 22 years, who claimed that Mao intentionally spread sexually transmitted diseases to some of his many mistresses. It's unclear whether this is true, but it's certainly possible. That Mao owned the largest pornographic book collection in China is pretty well documented, though. By the fall of 1949, the mopping up of Kuomintang resistance was enough of an accomplished fact to enable Mao to take the step he had long dreamed of. On October 1st of that year, he appeared at the Tiananmen Gate, which separates Tiananmen Square from the entrance to the Forbidden City, and officially proclaimed the existence of the People's Republic of China. This, one of the most famous photos of modern Chinese history, was taken on that day. This photo was colorized in modern times. Mao's tunic was actually gray, not brown, a minor detail. On October 1st, the retreat by KMT forces to Taiwan wasn't yet complete. It would be within 2 months, though. But the proclamation of the PRC was a public statement to the world that China was very definitely under new management. This was the day where Mao debuted the new Chinese flag, the one that is still in use today, and units of the People's Liberation Army paraded through Tiananmen Square. Many of them were riding American-built vehicles. Indeed, the communists had captured so much materiel that had originally been given by the United States to the KMT, most of it as Lend-Lease supplies during World War II, that Mao and other communist leaders often remarked sardonically that Chiang Kai-shek was their supply officer. Mao himself appears riding in a U.S. World War II Jeep in another famous photo from this same period. The Soviet Union and other communist states quickly recognized the PRC as the government of China. The US and Western countries, not so much. The final victory of the Chinese communists was a jolt to the West. In 1949, the United States was deeply involved in the early days of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Indeed, in the period 1946 to 49, Stalin had been busy setting up communist stooges as leaders of various buffer states, usually in countries that the Red Army had occupied when the music stopped, meaning when Germany and Japan surrendered in 1945. The only communist leader who really wasn't his stooge was Tito in Yugoslavia, but that's another story. American politics in 1949 and 1950 was consumed with the idea exemplified by the question, sometimes asked by Senator Joseph McCarthy and his allies, who lost China, or how did we lose China? This line was frequently used by Republicans as a criticism of Democratic President Harry Truman, suggesting he was insufficiently vigilant against communism and the fault must somehow track back to him. You should know, after going through this video, that the question is utterly absurd. It presupposes that China somehow belonged to the United States or to the anti-communist West, and something mysterious and treacherous happened in 1949 to take that away from them. Nothing can be farther from the truth. Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang lost China because they were bad leaders who pursued bad policies and governed the country incompetently. It had nothing whatsoever to do with the United States, much less Harry Truman. The idea that China belonged to the West or to the United States was simply a hangover from the colonialist days of 1900, the same myopia from which we get the term I criticized at the beginning of the video, the Boxer Rebellion. Those words imply that China's agency in resisting foreign influence and exploitation was somehow illegitimate, a revolt against proper authority. Who lost China or we lost China comes from much the same place. A colonialist mindset. Furthermore, the who lost China nonsense also presupposed that China, now under the rule of Mao, was basically a puppet or extension of Stalin's Soviet Union. As we'll see in the next chapter, that idea was also absurd. Mao and Stalin hated each other, and after 20 years of clawing his way into ultimate power, the last thing Mao Zedong would ever do was to subsume China's destiny to the will of a foreign dictator. If you take a long view, a very long view, of China's history between 1900 and 1950, one interpretation of the story is this. After thousands of years of dynastic rule collapsed in 1911 and 1912, the country fell into chaos and was split between the rule of warlord factions. After a long period of war and revolution, the factions whittled each other down to two, the Kuomintang and the Communists. There was a final battle between them, and the Communists won and established a new dynasty. This kind of story has precedents in previous Chinese history. There's literally a period in early Chinese history before the unification of the country under the Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi called the Warring States period, which you could read China's 20th century history as being kind of an analog of. At the beginning of Chapter 3, I described China's history as a cycle that repeats itself every few hundred years. What happened to China in the first half of the 20th century is entirely consistent with that cycle. Taking that view essentially makes Mao and his successors, Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping, the modern emperors of a new Chinese dynasty. One of the books I used to make this video takes that tack quite literally. China's long revolution was the foundation of a new dynasty. We're almost finished, but there are a few more threads worth following to cap off our story of China's tumultuous first half of the 20th century. After barely more than 8 weeks in power, In December 1949, Mao Zedong set out on a lengthy trip by train to the Soviet Union. The occasion was the celebration of Joseph Stalin's 70th birthday. The Soviet Union and China were in a strange and awkward embrace at this period. Although ostensibly allies, there was actually very deep distrust between them. In fact, during the Civil War, Stalin had been actively discouraging to the Communist Party's prospects. In 1946, Stalin urged Mao and the Communists not to engage in full-scale war against the Kuomintang. The Soviets thought the Reds would be defeated and they'd be back to square one in China and have to rebuild a new communist movement from scratch. Furthermore, since the 1920s, Stalin had generally treated Mao as an employee and frequently gave him or the Chinese Communist Party orders, which they refused to carry out. Neither Stalin nor Mao ever forgave a slight or were ever willing to let bygones be bygones. This was what the West, particularly American leaders, never understood about China, at least not until Nixon. The fact that China was now communist did not make the communist bloc a monolithic entity that acted with a unified plan and under careful coordination. While it was true that China's interests were more aligned with the Soviet Union than with non-communist countries, there was a great deal of nuance and indeed acrimony in their relationship. Mao traveled to Russia in December 1949 via the old Trans-Siberian Railway. Not an easy journey in the depths of winter. Diplomacy dictated that Mao was supposed to honor Stalin with gifts on his birthday, but he assiduously wanted to avoid looking like he was paying tribute to the Soviet dictator. So instead of expensive trinkets, he brought with him a load of produce, exotic Chinese fruits and vegetables that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. Stalin was so paranoid of being poisoned that he probably never tried any of them. The Chinese and Soviets signed a treaty concluded in February 1950 that rescinded most of the extraterritorial rights that Russia had held since the time of the Russo-Japanese War. The Soviet Union also threw China a few pennies of foreign aid, but it was less in absolute terms than the amount of foreign aid the United States was providing to the country of Ecuador. Stalin's Soviet Union and Mao's China were allies, but the level of cooperation between them and the depth of their commitment to each other left a lot to be desired. Mao wasted no time in enacting his broad agenda for the country. Shortly after the communists came to power, a new land reform policy went into effect, which did on a nationwide scale what the party had already been doing in areas they controlled. Land reform, which meant confiscating holdings of landlords, the so-called rich peasants, and redistributing them to the people. Landlords and other class enemies were subjected to persecution, including rituals called struggle sessions, where people were browbeaten into publicly confessing their sins against the revolution and against Mao Zedong thought. Sometimes it went beyond this. Anyone recognized as the bourgeoisie, as Mao and the Communist Party defined it, was targeted. Many were declared bandits. Ironic considering that was what Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT had labeled communists. Many were simply killed. Mao had no hesitation about using mass killings. Quote, "as long as we do not kill in error." End quote. In 1959, Mao reported that at least 1 million people had been suppressed or executed in the campaigns to reform land holdings and eliminate counter-revolutionaries in the period 1949 to 1951. On June 25, 1950, Chairman Mao awoke in his book-lined boudoir at Zhongnanhai and was briefed on the developments of the day. One of them involved the news that North Korean army units had struck south of the 38th parallel, invading South Korea. Mao's level of knowledge about the North Korean invasion is unclear. Harrison Salisbury, the author of The New Emperors, journalist, not a historian, contended that Mao was taken totally by surprise. I have a hard time believing that. Certainly, Mao and the upper levels of the Chinese government knew that Kim Il-sung, the communist North Korean dictator, was planning an invasion of South Korea to reunify the Korean peninsula by force. Kim had asked Stalin for supplies and help in planning, and Stalin seems to have discussed the matter with Mao. Nevertheless, the large-scale commitment of Chinese troops to the Korean War was not on the table at the beginning. Mao indeed was skeptical about the chances of Kim pulling it off. Mao and the communist leaders, including Stalin, panicked after Western forces, the bulk of them Americans, under a United Nations banner, counterattacked near Incheon in September 1950 and drove North Korean forces back to the north of Korea. The UN Security Council was only able to authorize the Korean War at all because the Soviets, who held veto power, were boycotting the UN for its refusal to recognize Mao's regime as the legitimate government of China. Technically, the KMT regime on Taiwan still held China's Security Council seat. In the end, though, Mao decided that he couldn't let the North Koreans go down entirely. In October 1950, units of the Chinese People's Liberation Army crossed the river at the north of the Korean peninsula and joined the war. For the first time since the Yihechun uprising, Chinese troops were engaging in direct combat with Americans. Cold War didn't seem so cold anymore. Another major item on Mao's to-do list, once the communists were in power, was to secure their control over as much traditional Chinese territory as possible. It was not possible, at least not yet, to eliminate the KMT stronghold on Taiwan, but Tibet was another matter. The question of whether Tibet was an independent country or part of China was a murky one in 1949. Though it had traditionally been dominated by the Chinese emperors, the governments of China after 1911 pretty much had their hands full, and they couldn't really spare any bandwidth to go conquer Tibet. Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT insisted that Tibet was in fact Chinese, but between 1911 and 1949, the country was more or less independent, ruled by a religious figure, the Dalai Lama. The 13th Dalai Lama, who asserted Tibet's independence, died in 1933. The 14th Dalai Lama was still a kid throughout the entirety of the World War II era. But the thing was, Tibet lacked diplomatic contact or any sort of sustained engagement with the outside world. It was an independent country on paper, but no other country was really willing to stick up for it. In 1949, Mao reaffirmed that Tibet was a part of China. The objection by Tibet and some Western powers resulted in some half-hearted negotiations between the two countries, mediated by the governments of the UK and India. Long story short, the negotiations went nowhere. The Tibetans suggested the maintenance of what they called a priest-patron relationship, where Tibet would be technically independent, but kind of within the orbit of China. This was how they had seen their relationship with the dynastic emperors. Mao would have none of it, though. In early October 1950, the same month that Chinese troops poured into Korea, units of the People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet. Hostilities were short-lived, as you might expect. Tibet didn't have much of an army. Tibetan representatives signed a document recognizing Chinese annexation of Tibet in May 1951, but it wasn't accepted by the Dalai Lama until October. The Chinese army occupied Lhasa, the spectacular mountain capital of Tibet. This was certainly not the end of the controversies regarding Tibet, but Mao at least considered it the last word. By the end of 1950, 50 years and 6 months since the Yihechun attacked the foreign legations in Beijing, the long Chinese Revolution was mostly over. The old dynasty had crumbled, the period of chaos that swirled up in its wake was over, and the new emperor had taken command. It's impossible to count how many millions, tens of millions of Chinese died in the various catastrophes during those 50 years. But one thing was absolutely certain: the world would never be the same. Here's what happened to some of the major players in our story in later years. Puyi, the last Qing emperor, was knocked off the throne of the Japanese puppet state Manchukuo in 1945. He was totally out of touch as emperor, and in fact believed the Japanese were winning the war until nearly its end. He was captured by Soviet troops during the invasion of Manchuria in August 1945 and held in prison in the Soviet Union for 5 years. This portion of his life was totally left out of the Last Emperor movie for some reason. Repatriated to China in 1950 after the communist victory, Puyi, considered a war criminal, spent 9 years in a communist prison, during which he tried to rehabilitate himself in the eyes of the new regime. Released in 1959, he married again in 1962 and generally spoke positively of the People's Republic and its politics. He died in Beijing in 1967 of kidney cancer and heart disease. Puyi's father, Prince Chun, who was his regent for a time, entered private life in 1912 after his son abdicated. In the 1930s, he tried to warn his famous son not to get involved with the Japanese in Manchukuo, but he didn't listen. Chun was friendly toward the communists in later years. He died in Beijing in 1951. The warlords are too numerous to chase down one by one, but I'll mention a few. You would think they all died in battle, but actually you'd be wrong. Zhang Zun, the guy who tried to put Puyi back on the throne, retreated from military and public life after his failure and died peacefully in 1923. Duan Qirui also died in self-imposed exile, not battle, after he lost power. He passed away in 1936. Ken Chunshan, who said if Yuan Shikai lived, he'd die, ended up dying himself in 1933 of tuberculosis. Wu Peifu, defeated by Chang in the Northern Expedition, retired and died of sepsis after some dental work went badly wrong in 1939. Of all the warlords, the one who had the most unique circumstances later in life was Zhang Zhuiliang, who, as you recall, engineered the Xi'an incident in December 1936. He remained under house arrest for over 50 years. The Nationalists moved him from house to house during their period of reign, World War II and the Civil War. As I mentioned earlier, they brought him with them to Taiwan in 1949, where he lived in this house. He was married 3 times, the last time in 1964. His wife, a Christian, encouraged him to convert to Christianity, which he did. After the death of Chiang Kai-shek's son in January 1988, the Taiwanese government finally lifted Zhang Zhuiliang's house arrest sentence. In the 1990s, Zhang moved to Honolulu. He died in October 2001 at the age of 100, the last major survivor of the Warlord Era. He'd outlived his jailer, Chiang Kai-shek, by over 25 years. Sung Mei-ling, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, lived even longer. She served as First Lady of the Republic of China, Taiwan, until her husband's death in 1975. She never lost her American connections, maintaining a house in Oyster Bay, New York, and a vacation home in New Hampshire. She moved to New York after 1975 and lived in this famous co-op, 10 Gracie Square in Manhattan. In fact, she died there in 2003 at the age of 105. Chiang Kai-shek resumed his duties as president of the Republic of China in March 1950. He remained in power for the rest of his life. Though not technically a fascist, he behaved in very authoritarian ways, maintaining Taiwan as a one-party state, repressing dissent, and often speaking admiringly of other authoritarian leaders. He is today quite hated by many modern Taiwanese. Chang ruled with the same enhanced emergency powers that he had used to subvert China's constitution during the war with the Japanese and World War II. Taiwan was technically under martial law from 1949 until 1987. We don't know how many dissidents and potential enemies of the state Chang had tortured and executed during an extended period of repression known as the White Terror. This is a second White Terror following the one of 1927, but estimates have at least 140,000 people being imprisoned, mostly intellectuals and other elites who Chang feared might turn against the KMT government. As the head of the good or non-communist China, Chang was naturally befriended by Western powers, who contributed a lot of the economic aid and commercial ties that built Taiwan's economy in the post-war decades, and the military hardware that prevented the People's Republic from trying to take over the island. Though ironically, Chang was highly distrustful of American leaders and the CIA in particular. Chang even planned an invasion of the mainland to topple the PRC in 1962. The idea was squelched by the US, but he never gave it up, and he continued to lobby for an invasion for years. After being in poor health for some time, Chiang Kai-shek died on April 5, 1975, at the age of 87, of a heart attack. He was given a grand state funeral commensurate with the cult of personality that he'd built around himself. Demonstrating the lie of Taiwan's supposedly democratic system, power passed to his son, Chiang Ching-kuo. His reign was somewhat less repressive, and he loosened some of the restrictions on Taiwanese society. But the democratization of Taiwan was far from complete when he died in January 1988. Many of Mao's cronies went on to have high leadership positions in the People's Republic of China. Lin Biao, one of the military heroes of the Long March and the Civil War, served as Minister of National Defense and Vice Premier. His relationship with Mao and other communist leaders, however, eventually became strained. In 1971, he died when his plane crashed under mysterious circumstances in Mongolia. Speculation and conspiracy theories have surrounded the Lin Biao incident ever since. The Chinese government claimed he was plotting a coup against Mao at the time. True? Well, we'll probably never know. Zhou Enlai was in many ways even more important to the Second Chinese Revolution than Mao was. He was Mao's right-hand man for decades and was essentially the de facto leader of China in Mao's twilight years. He was the PRC's foreign minister after 1949. Zhou is most recognizable in the West for his prominent role in U.S. President Richard Nixon's diplomatic visit to China in 1972, and Zhou Enlai appears in most of the very famous pictures of that event. He died in January 1976. Deng Xiaoping became the leader of China after an abortive attempt by a group of conspirators called the Gang of Four, which included Mao's widow Chiang to take over the country. It was truly Deng who increased China's economic engagement with the rest of the world and built the foundations of the modern economy that China has become in decades since. Much of the electronic equipment used to make this video was manufactured in China. That's indirectly because of Deng Xiaoping. Nevertheless, his legacy is highly mixed. He is the man who ordered, or at least approved of, the massacre of pro-democracy demonstrators in and around Tiananmen Square in June 1989. Despite smoking 5 packs of unfiltered cigarettes a day for most of his adult life, Deng lived into his 90s and finally perished in 1997. Mao Zedong's legacy is perhaps even more complicated. Though one of the most effective revolutionary leaders the world has ever seen, as a national leader, Mao proved to be an almost unqualified disaster. The Great Leap Forward of the 1950s, in which Mao hoped to modernize and industrialize China through a crash program, was a ghastly failure that killed millions of people. By the mid-1960s, fearing he was fading into irrelevance in the Communist Party he once had tight control over, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, one of the most grievous wounds a modern country has ever inflicted upon itself. Both the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution are beyond the scope of this video. Mao Zedong died in September 1976. You can see his embalmed corpse, if you like, at the Chairman Mao Memorial Hall in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. I have to blur this image on the free version of the video, but it's unredacted in the members section version. China's experience in the first half of the 20th century is among the most tumultuous and consequential stories of any nation in modern times. The twists and turns in the story of China's revolutions were unpredictable at the time, confusing in retrospect, and catastrophic to the hundreds of millions who lived through them and the tens of millions who didn't. After watching this video, I hope you can understand why I was so captivated by this story the first time I learned it more than 30 years ago. It's a lot to take in, but a story I think we should try to make sense of if we want to have a hope of understanding how today's world works. China matters. Thus, by definition, its history is important. Hopefully, you now have a better understanding of it than when you started. If you liked this video, please hit the like button, share it, give it a thumbs up, do all the stuff you normally do for a video you like. As you probably know by now, there is a members section here on my YouTube channel, which you can join for $5 a month. There you'll find an ad-free version of this video, with the additional material I couldn't cover here and no redactions. The sources I used to make this video are listed in credits at the end and also down below in the description. One of Dr. Porter's books is on the list, which I think is fitting for a video dedicated to him. A couple of people have asked about the heavy metal t-shirts I wear in these videos. I made a list of the ones that appear in this video, and it's in the description too. As usual, I want to say that no part of this video, including the research or writing of the script, was done with AI. Believe it or not, some people think I'm lying when I say that, but it is true. My crime novel that came out in December 2024, The Gangster Crown, is available on Amazon Kindle and in paperback. The link to that is in the description. I also put out a mystery last year called Daniel Vanished, which is fun. I teach history classes online at my website, seanmunger.com, and you can sign up for my blog at gardenofmemory.net and get the columns delivered directly to your email. On that blog at the paid tier, I write articles that go behind the scenes of the making of these videos and my thoughts on them, if you're interested. Thank you to all my fans and supporters, and thank you once again for joining me on another journey into the past.